Terrence McKenna once said that the shaman is a madman who has healed himself. Um, Although I don't necessarily use the title shaman in reference to myself, I can definitely relate to that statement to an unfortunate degree. In the stream, we're going to talk about rewiring our nervous system. And this is going to be part of a series, I think, because when I was kind of doing my outline today and researching, I just realized it's just such a sprawling, massive subject. Tonight, we're going to just kind of talk about the history, how I got into this practice, how I developed the protocol and why, how I got involved in ayahuasca, and how that sort of ties in to all of this stuff. So basically, the system is about healing trauma, cognitive hygiene, and it is based upon knowledge and practices from various esoteric traditions, but largely philosophically informed by Hermeticism and South American shamanism, and also a deep understanding of modern disciplines like psychology and cognitive science and neuroscience. And that aspect of this sort of work is tremendously important. The understanding of the mechanisms that underlie our cognition and our cognitive profiles. You know, it's really important to understand this stuff. But research has shown, and I'm getting ahead of myself now, but research has shown that if you actually know which subsystems are engaged in various processes, you're better able to manage that with self-directed neuroplasticity. Your awareness of the mechanisms that underlie everything actually gives you a sort of access to the wiring of the board. And that's something that I feel like in self-healing practices and also guided modalities like ayahuasca or, you know, any sort of alternative therapeutic modality, the cognitive hygiene aspect and the necessity for intellectual enrichment is really neglected. Let me check in with the chat real quick and then try to organize my notes here, which you'll have to bear with me. I did make an outline, but when I do those outlines and research, I tend to have ideas and then I go off topic and it ends up being really sprawling. So check in with the chat. Okay, we're good. So basically, I had a super fucked up childhood. My parents were teenagers when I was born, and they were both actually mentally ill, full blown mental illness. Of course, when you're isolated by mentally ill parents, and that's all you know because we didn't have a lot of association with family, we didn't really have family friends. In school, I was a complete loner. So I didn't really even understand that, you know, my mom was literally insane, which is really confusing. But long story short, well, actually, I should mention also that my environment was extremely dangerous, which plays into all this. So I never had any kind of feeling of safety or security. My mother had NPD and probably other, you know, comorbidities. My father figure had extremely low self-esteem and either NPD or borderline. So I was getting it from both directions, and it was sort of like they were engineered for maximum self-esteem damage, right? And interestingly, this kind of early abuse can result in cognitive superpowers because you become hypervigilant, monitoring your environment. People with borderline personality disorder, which I did end up with, have the ability to read people almost to a supernatural degree. Pattern recognition is likely enhanced by these experiences, these negative experiences. But because of the context, right? I mean, really all adaptations are driven by trauma in some sense, by danger, existential threats. You know, they don't generally come from positive experiences. I'm not saying growth. I'm talking about hardware adaptations, genetic modification, that kind of thing. So you end up with misaligned assets. And that's a term that I coined, but it basically means that your pattern recognition superpowers are going to be misapplied, right? So, for example, something I caught myself doing recently is that I've always had this, I guess, overgeneralization problem with people that kind of talk like they're in the office all the time. Like really like instant distrust and maybe even dislike if you just kind of come off like a muggle yuppie or something, you know? And that's not entirely wrong. You know, but I over applied it to a pretty extreme degree. Right. And I realized recently that just because someone dictates themselves like that, it could even be rooted in this childhood, this show, Leave It to Beaver. I don't know if any of you guys would remember that, but there was a character named Eddie Haskell, and he was a psychopath, basically, and he would use his glib charm to charm the parents, and then he would go burn cats or whatever. And I would see this starting really early in life where people, I could tell that they were psychopaths or you know what I mean? That there was something, some kind of masking going on, and I would watch them dazzle and charm people and just be blown away by it. So I think maybe all of that played into this. But I realized that some people are just like professionals and they may be very helpful and even ethical and just come off as like kind of plastic and like you're in an office, you know? So that's what I mean by misaligned assets. And there are other more extreme presentations of that, right? So, I guess it's worth mentioning in case you're new to my work in general, that my MO basically has always been about building an ontological bridge between science and what we generally call spirituality, although I think we need a new term. When I say it, I don't necessarily mean exactly that, but that's just an important kind of note to be aware of as we're going deeper into this subject. So I guess long story shortish, that early childhood trauma resulted in borderline personality disorder. And I was always aware, I think intuitively, that I was going to need some help. You know, I didn't really perceive what was going on in my home as abuse exactly. I thought my mom was just kind of an angry bitch, and, you know, my father figure was just kind of mean sometimes when he drank or something. You know, it didn't really process how extreme and how bad this was. I mean, the man would tell me that everything I ever did was doomed to fail for over and over and over again from the time that I was like 4 or something, you know, like really severe self-esteem attacks. And by the time I was in my late teens or early 20s, I had noticed that I had psychopathic tendencies, that I was capable of like full-blown psychopathy, but I had empathy, and those behaviors were not consistent with like my moral framework or the person that I was. I had noticed that they could be triggered, and then I would snap out of it. And now I understand it has to do with the amygdala and certain subsystems being completely turned off when certain triggers occur, and the borderline personality person can switch and actually become a psychopath. And then, you know, it's typical, you'll just snap out of it. And it's really terrifying because you have no control over it. And I went to jail, you know, people got hurt. It was pretty bad. And the triggers were strange. And mostly, in order to get an intense reaction, it would have to be some serious infraction that someone had committed or represented, an actual threat. However, there were certain things that I now understand were related to fear of abandonment and, just various triggers that would set me off, that later I was like, what in the fuck is wrong with me? Because it's not who I was. I did not approve of this kind of it didn't make any sense to me. And after I started really getting in trouble, and also I just didn't like the things that I was doing, I became really determined to self-diagnose. And the reason for that is that my mother actually took me to a child therapist when I was in second or third grade. And this led to me being very much therapy adverse, because after the second or third session, and this was a tremendous mistake on the part of this woman, but she told my mother in front of me that I was too intelligent for therapy and that she was actually afraid she was going to end up on the couch. And she didn't want to see me anymore. So that pathologized my intelligence, which is not cool. And it also made me therapy adverse. I don't know that she wasn't wrong, that it may not have helped much. But yeah, that's, looking back, it's not like I consciously was aware of that at the time, but looking back, I think that was probably the moment that I was like, okay, I got to figure this out myself. So somehow I missed borderline personality disorder. I read about psychopathy. For a minute, I thought I was a prosocial psychopath, because I'm very emotionally flat a lot of the time. But I do have a lot of just like organic altruistic impulse, like I want to do good things for society as a sort of, it's like my just innate predisposition. But I do have empathy, so that didn't quite fit. And then I read about MPD and I was like, well, I might have some of these characteristics, but that doesn't quite fit. So nothing fit, and I just had no real, frame to put myself in. It just wasn't entirely consistent with anything. And we're going to get into what all that is about. This is a tremendous problem in psychology and in therapy. The diagnostic of a dynamic fluid system like a human being is extremely difficult. And when you are characterizing someone psychologically or otherwise, and you're in a position of authority, as a therapist is in a sense, you have the ability to, if you mischaracterize something, you can seriously fuck with people. Basically, I mean, that's the easiest way to say it. Let me check in with the chat one more time, and then we are going to jump in to dynamic disease models and the basin of attraction and all of these things that represent a sort of recursion at a higher level of the field of psychology and cognitive science. This is really a wonderful time to be alive if you're interested in cognition and psychology, and I mean, all sorts of things are just our understanding is really deepening. So let's see, you are that awareness, stories projecting on you. Yeah, you can ask questions, of course. I mean, it's a live stream. What location did I grow up? I grew up right outside of Washington, D.C. for the most part, about 20 minutes from Washington, D.C. And that was also an issue. Narcissism and borderline are increasingly common throughout society. And where I lived was the second wealthiest county per capita in the United States, second only to L.A. And I was extremely poor. We had no indoor plumbing. We had an outhouse. Our neighbors were inbred and they fed their pit bulls gunpowder to make them mean, and they would escape because they would get drunk or whatever and leave the cages open, and they formed a pack in the neighborhood, and they would destroy, like I would go out in the morning to go to school and our cat would be in 3,000 pieces in the front yard, just hair and blood everywhere. Neighbors, I watched my babysitter shoot at some guys beating her brother with a lead pipe when I was like 8 or something, and saw the aftermath of a murder. I mean, he wasn't dead yet, 18-year-old kid. I could go on and on and on. That was my neighborhood. But right down the street, we had like a girl that I went to school with brought a picture of Reagan and Schwarzenegger that had been at her house for dinner the night before. And this was only a mile away. So we had gentrification closing in from all sides. And it is a true fact that the children of, say, the CEO of ExxonMobil, who was my best friend in high school, his father was a CEO of Mobil. They are narcissistic. They are psychopathic. It's as you climb up the corporate ladder or the political ladder or any power structure hierarchy, the concentration of psychopaths increases exponentially as you reach the top, right? In fact, roughly 1% of the population are believed to be psychopaths, and then we have the 1% at the top of the pyramid, and I am willing to bet that most of them are in that bubble. So, what I was getting at is that the few people that I did associate with in high school and whatnot, we weren't nice to each other. People carried guns a lot. Your worth was kind of predicated on how dangerous you were to a large extent. And even people that weren't really like that, on the East Coast, sarcasm, someone is your friend because they're mean to you. When I moved out to California, I was kind of a culture shock because I would say sarcastic things to people, and someone had to tell me people in California don't necessarily even understand what sarcasm is. And I'm like, oh man, I really got some rewiring to do. So, I guess I more than answered that question. So serious self-esteem issues, borderline personality disorder, hints of psychopathy. I knew that I needed to do something, and I had developed a very early interest in psychedelics. I'm talking like really early, 11 years old or so. Not that I had taken them, but I started reading books by Timothy Leary and Robert Anton Wilson, and in junior high, I found Terence McKenna and did I say Robert Anton Wilson? So I had a pretty good understanding of what these compounds did, and I had a very deep interest in them. I understood their traditional roles. I'd read, Wade Davis's One River, which I wholeheartedly recommend. It's an amazing book and really shaped a lot of my life. I actually ended up, without intention, living with a band of Warani that have been made famous by the movie. I think it's called At the Tip or something like that. But the story where they landed in the jungle and they killed a whole family of missionaries, speared them all. But we actually ended up living with their grandkids, and that was like such a huge inspiration, that book, when I was a kid. But I knew all about ayahuasca before anyone knew what the hell it was. When I was in high school, I would bring it up and people would like, what the hell are you talking about? So I did have a tremendous amount of success with just psilocybin mushrooms and LSD. A couple of times I probably took MDMA. But after one particularly intense incident, I almost went to jail, and I thought, I really have to do something about this. Somebody's going to get unalived maybe, or, and I don't like not being able to control myself. I mean, it's an insane thing to be a fundamentally good and gentle person, but then some people can just push a button and I just turn into a psycho all of a sudden, that it just was not acceptable. So with a single heroic dose of mushrooms, I was able to, the journey allowed me to rewire and bring myself into coherence to the degree that I did not have another violent outburst, at least not for many, many, many years, which is really extraordinary. And that is when psychedelic medicine really got my attention, because I saw the potential. I had known the potential for a long time, but that experience to go from behavior that was so utterly out of control and destructive and dangerous to having resolved it to that degree in a single dose by myself with no guidance, it was just absolutely extraordinary. After weeks and months went by, and I realized this actually did something really significant in my psyche. And so that kind of directed my attention to neuroscience and cognitive science, which at the time there was not nearly as much evidence available. But I understood intuitively that we had the ability to rewrite programs in our brains. And that is when I really started working towards developing metacognition and also the capacity to attenuate my own default mode network and neural gating through Hegelian dialectic thinking and psychoanalysis and mindfulness practices, pranayama, all of these different techniques from all of these different traditions and disciplines. And that eventually led to a major breakthrough, which was understanding as above, so below, and pattern recognition. So aside from all of the psychological baggage and the issues that I had to work through, the other side of my life was all about trying to follow what I call the invisible thread, and solve certain mysteries, both personal and cosmological, I guess, or metaphysical. And I had experiences that might be framed as like psi-type experiences or non-ordinary cognition, starting in early childhood. And I was a GATE kid, and it's come out that for sure the GATE program was actually about testing gifted children for ESP. There was not one, well, no, there was. There was one class and one field trip in the entire year that I was in the program. All the rest of it was audio hypnosis, some pink drink that erased your memory, Zinner card tests, code cracking in Russian and stuff. It was completely insane, looking back on it. And I did notice at the time, but that's interesting to me that I was singled out somehow as potentially having that kind of capacity in first or second grade. Topic for another time. But I'd become really interested in this because I had absolute certainty that it was real, that I would produce sometimes anticipations of science, that I was constantly, my entire life, I hear feedback from people that I see things that people generally don't see. And as above, so below kind of revealed pattern recognition to me before I even had a name for it. It just suddenly clicked that what was going on is that there's actually one underlying blueprint for all of the architectures and dynamics in the universe. All of the generative mechanisms use a single pattern, and variation is created through recombinatorial differentiation, right? That's what's going on there. So that ability to recognize patterns, to compress them and extract information, I realized was a tremendously important cognitive capacity that was not common enough in the human race. Right. So while I was kind of trying to figure out my own problems, I always had this sort of transposition that would occur where I could see how the same solutions applied to sociological developmental trajectories and whatnot, things that were severely out of alignment in the collective, and how this pattern recognition could be developed and trained and taught, or somehow sort of distributed, and that today, that's one of my biggest goals. That's why I am so immersed in cognitive science research and dynamic systems theory research, distributed intelligence. Michael Levin is a tremendously important person. Dr. Schooler's now theory of consciousness. I don't want to get too off track here and go, too deeply into this. But speaking of this transposition of patterns, if you look at Dr. Michael Levin's work in biological collective goal state systems, and then you look at Dr. Jonathan Schooler's nested observer window theory of consciousness, you'll see that it's the exact same framework, but one is in cognitive science and or cognition generally, and the other is biological systems. But it's exactly the same thing with a slightly different context. So, by the way, I've written a piece on Substack that I just made free for the next 7 days called Synchronicity in a Holographic Universe, about how it is that meaning can be architectural and what that means in terms of individual coherence and the resulting architectural and dynamic alignment with your environment and your experience. So that is definitely worth checking out. Yeah, the network theory of psychopathology isn't probably something we should get into too. Let me check in with the chat one more time, see how you guys are doing. You also mentioned a tobacco enema help with anger issues. I can't say anything positive about that plant on YouTube. It actually is an instant strike. So I'm not going to talk about that, but I do have on Substack, again, it's an uncensored platform, so I have a lot more freedom there, but I can't even talk about. They sent out a notification telling us that if anyone says anything positive. And the reason they did that, it was in response to research that a certain plant, I'm not going to say it even, actually has anti-tumor efficacy. And days after that announcement was made, we got this notification saying, don't you dare talk about this. So that's pretty wild. Sorry, guys, I'm just kind of trying to follow my outline here. There is research actually on the efficacy of psilocybin for BPD treatment. Psilocybin acts as a 5-HT2A or acts on the 5-HT2A receptors in the cortex, producing temporary suppression of the default mode network. Increased entropy in neural activity, more flexible information processing, and acute window of heightened neuroplasticity. In BPD, this is significant because the disorder is characterized by rigid hyperactive emotional schemas and impaired prefrontal limbic regulation. Neural patterns that can be disrupted by psilocybin's effect on cortical hierarchy. Preclinical data shows that psilocybin promotes dendritic spine growth in frontal cortex neurons and restores PPC connection loss to chronic stress. And early human data shows reductions in rumination, rigid self-narrative, and emotional hyperreactivity following guided sessions. Formal clinical trials for VPT specifically are in early stages as of 2026, but pilot data and theoretical frameworks are converging. This is a really simple thing to understand. It, to me, also is evidence of distributed intelligence in the universe. How this is even an argument is beyond me. But when we attenuate, even temporarily, the default mode network in our brain, our absurdly narrow vantage point of a singular, looking at the universe from a singular point of view is temporarily disrupted. And that holistic experience allows us to entrain with the field of distributed intelligence. And I happen to think that Levin's goal state model is something that is universal. So human beings have that in our collective consciousness, right? We have a collective goal state. And I'm also of the opinion that the reason that we're generally out of sync with it's almost entirely a matter of social engineering. I really do think that the entrainment with that goal state could negate the necessity for coercive rule to a large extent. We really do have solutions for, I don't want to necessarily say optimizing absolutely, but certainly tremendous improvement on our socioeconomic systems and whatnot are completely available. And the only reason that those things aren't being enacted or instituted or whatever the word is that it doesn't serve a small group of psychopaths. But, during that state where we have we're plugged right in to the field of distributed intelligence, we are entrained with coherence. And that coherence actually informs our brain and empowers our brain to make corrections and rewrite the programming. What's really interesting to me about this is that it seems like just such a tremendously serendipitous circumstance that psychedelics have this ability to not only open us up to less rigid thinking and self-realization and an expanded capacity to holistically perceive ourselves and our relationships and our relationship to our environment. But they also just happen to have this neuroplasticity enhancing and neurogenesis catalyzing capacity. It just seems just so remarkable that these compounds have so many layers of efficacy that are all interrelated, I personally also suspect that the reason our eyes dilate when we take psychedelics, our pupils dilate, is not just the serotonin response in the brain, which is what the medical literature will tell you. I'm not saying that isn't part of it or it isn't true, but in my experience, everything has some kind of purpose and reason and function. That's like the map and not the territory sort of thing. I suspect that we are perceiving more of the full spectrum of light, and that those normally invisible spectrum, that part of the bandwidth, carries a different type of information than like visible light. So that I believe also is a layer of the power of psychedelic medicine, I guess. Of course, that's extremely hypothetical. It's just my theory. Of course, ayahuasca is extremely effective for this kind of thing as well. Let me check in with the chat again. Hair care tips welcome. What? Does my hair look like it's groomed or something? Okay, I don't see any more questions, so I guess let's carry on with our protocol here. Okay, so we just went through brain-derived neurotropic factor is an interesting subject, but it's not as relevant as. Um, so most of you guys are probably familiar with the default mode network. This is something that is when I was earlier in the stream, I was talking about how understanding the mechanisms that facilitate our perception, how important it is to have a conscious awareness of the actual mechanisms that underlie these processes, right? The default mode network and like our predictive processing and what is generally things that fall under the category of neural gating or neural filtering, right? This is humanity's number one enemy right now. It blinds us to our own behavior, and it facilitates delusions. Even worse, our nervous system has the ability to actually edit our perception, to mediate the meaning of information before it even reaches the conscious brain. So this is why, in most cases, self-diagnosis is not really advisable. In my case, I had an unusual level of self-awareness and objectivity, and again, that superpower was a response largely to abuse, which is messed up, but it's true. One of the reasons for it is that my mother, having NPD, would constantly accuse me of being extremely manipulative and lying and all of these things along those lines. And it wasn't true, but I developed the habit of really monitoring my thinking and my behavior in order to make sure she was wrong. So from a very, very young age, I was kind of overriding a lot of the potential for the nervous system to generate a model for me to believe about myself or whatever. I developed a protocol basically for observing and analyzing my own behavior from a very young age. But you can do this at any time and at any point. And it's something that, just like anything else, the more structure you have, the more technical understanding you have in all of the related domains, the more of an investiture your psychedelic experiences and meditation and whatever other kind of transcendental exercises that you engage in, the cognitive hygiene aspect, the understanding of the neuroscience, all of these things are going to facilitate this transformation in a tremendous way. And it's not actually that difficult to learn about these things. People hear neuroscience and they're like, oh shit, that's going to be boring and tedious. And it's not really. And what is required of you is not to have a PhD level understanding of these things, but just a general working understanding. So the default mode network is a set of brain regions, primarily the medial prefrontal cortex, posterior cingulate cortex, and angular gyrus, that are active when you are not focused on a task during mind-wandering, self-reflection, autobiographical, memory retrieval, and rumination. The DMN is essentially the neural substrate of the narrator self, the part of the mind that constructs and maintains your story about who you are, basically your ego. In depression, PTSD, and BPD, the DMN becomes overactive and hyperconnective. Self-referential rumination loops dominate and become rigid. So this kind of brings us back. In fact, I'm going to scroll back to the top of my notes so that I can explain this really well. Earlier in the stream, I was talking about how I had a lot of trouble putting myself in a category because nothing fit completely. I didn't really land squarely into any of these categories. Another thing that is unusual is that my default mode network is broken. This is why I believe that I have such good access to the pattern recognition in my subconscious. There's so much crosstalk. And it may actually be because I almost drowned as a child. Almost every single gate kid, or maybe all of them, but certainly this is a thing. We all had near drowning incidents as toddlers, and the theory is that it resulted in some sort of almost like constructive brain damage. So the default mode network, some part of the hardware suffered from apoxia or hypoxia, and it lost some of its gating abilities. And so there's more subsystem crosstalk, and things bleed over from the subconscious. But that's not consistent with people with borderline personality disorder. It's supposed to do the opposite. So this is where basin of attraction kind of models come in, and I'll talk about that for a second. In dynamical systems math, an attractor is a state or a set of states that a system gravitates toward and returns to after small disturbances. The basin of attraction is the region of all starting conditions that will eventually lead the system to that attractor. Think of it as a gravitational well. Applied to psychology, a healthy regulated state is a wide, deep basin, hard to knock you out of and easy to return to. In BPD, the healthy basin becomes shallow and narrow. Pathological states, emotional crisis, disassociation, impulsive discharge have their own basins. Basins are not fixed. They shift with context, accumulated stress, relational environment, and interventions like plant medicine or sustained practice. This is the mathematical reason why you are not your diagnosis. The system is always in motion and always in flux. Dynamic disease is one whose core features are fundamentally temporal. So they live in how the system changes over time and not in any static snapshot. Examples from medicine are cardiac arrhythmia, epilepsy. You can't really understand them from a single EKG reading. You have to watch the waveform. BPD is a dynamic disease because its defining features, emotional ability, identity instability, impulsive reactivity, are by definition patterns of change, not fixed states. This is why a cross-sectional clinical interview standard practice captures a system mid-trajectory and mistakes a phase of the process for the whole thing. The person gets labeled based on where the river happened to be when the photograph was taken, right? So this is another reason when I say that I am conventional therapy adverse. This kind of tendency to categorize things in a non-static system, I think, is a tremendous mistake. And I often talk about how, and this is something that you can verify. We have our testimonials on our website and on the Jungle Gnosis Facebook page. But I get a lot of feedback that I have been able to help people with things that when decades of psychologists and drugs and conventional therapeutic modalities failed. The reason for that, and we're going to get into the evidence for this, or the cognitive science explanation, I guess, is actually a lack of formal training. And it's also experience, right? I've been there. When Terence McKenna said that the shaman is a madman who has healed himself, the reason that you have to do it for yourself, if your destiny is to be a shaman or some kind of healer, if you know how to recognize all of the things, how the analytics work, and you have managed to reassemble or bring your own internal coherence, to elevate that, you're going to be able to do that for other people. So, yeah. And then there are also switching. There's switching is when like a borderline person permanently becomes a psychopath, or vice versa. People with MPD can switch. As we progress in our sophistication, I guess, of our understanding of all of these things, the old models are breaking down very, very rapidly. And what we're seeing is that psychologists are coming up with new terms to explain variations and different clusters of comorbidities constantly. Now there's covert MPD and covert borderline and covert this and covert that. And then there's the quiet borderline. And there's, they just keep coming up with all these categorizations and labels for what is really a dynamic system that is always going to defy that kind of categorization, at least that kind of explicit categorization. So psychiatric attractor states or complex systems in psychiatry, This extends attractor theory to the full architecture of psychiatric presentations. The emerging network theory of psychopathology argues that mental disorders are not brain diseases with a single underlying cause, but rather emergent patterns, stable configurations of systems, behaviors, and physiological states that mutually reinforce each other. Depression, for existence, is not low serotonin. It is a system of nodes, sleep disturbance, anhedonia, rumination, social withdrawal, fatigue, that activate each other in a positive feedback loop until the whole network reaches a self-sustaining attractor state. This explains why disorders are comorbid so frequently. Adjacent attractor basins share boundaries, and a system under sufficient stress can traverse from one to the other. It also predicts critical transitions, the sudden tipping points people describe where they just snap, that are characteristics of complex systems passing through bifurcation manifolds. So again, this pattern recognition and transposition, you see that the same kind of theoretical frameworks that explain information systems in a digital context apply to information systems in biological contexts. And this is a really important thing to notice, because you'll also see that it happens in society, that this arc or developmental trajectory arc is present in all systems where there is any form of cognition. So on the sociological, cultural scale, on the individual scale, the digital realm, and going all the way down potentially to the Planck scale, if you subscribe to John Schooler's theory of nested observers, the now theory of consciousness, which it's kind of speculative to say we have observer windows going down to the Planck scale, but I have an intuitive feeling that that's probably correct. But yeah, that's tremendously important. One of the reasons it's so important is that once you are able to inculcate this pattern recognition, it really only comes down to seeing one pattern and training your brain to seek it out and recognize it, and to practice a little bit the transposition so that your brain knows how to do it. And then eventually your subconscious just locks onto it. And all of a sudden you find yourself being able to extract information from all kinds of systems about all kinds of other systems. So you could pretty much study anything and learn almost everything about everything else, because it truly is a holographic information system with one underlying architectural and dynamic blueprint, right? And whether you're talking about healing and transforming yourself or healing and transforming society, this is the key fucking thing to unlock everything. It really is. And anyone can do it. It just is a matter of having some structure and how would you say, like routinely attenuating the default mode network, bringing the neural gating down. But you need to know what you're doing during that window when you have that access in order to really maximize the investiture. So research on, and we're using BPD, by the way, not just because I had it, and I guess you could say I still do. I don't really know if these things are completely curable, but they are definitely manageable. And it's also true that as you get older, people, even psychopaths, sometimes it wears off. They just suddenly have empathy when they're 45. And the borderline tends to peak in the late 20s for males. I don't know if it's different for women. The symptoms are different. The way that it presents is different. But it does generally tend to kind of mellow out with age anyways. I feel like I kind of lost my train of thought there, so let's jump back into my notes. Well, actually, that's not even necessary to talk about. We can talk about polyvagal hierarchy, I guess. Stephen Porges' polyvagal theory proposes that the ANS is organized into 3 phylogenetically ordered circuits, each corresponding to a distinct behavioral and emotional state. Ventral vagal complex is evolutionarily the newest and the most uniquely mammalian part of our nervous system. And it's active when the system detects safety associated with social engagement, facial expressivity, prosody, co-regulation, open curiosity, and the capacity to be moved emotionally without being destabilized. It's important also to understand that one because we have to be aware of the tricks of the nervous system. Right. And in that case, the fact that we have a sort of biological predisposition or nervous system predisposition to trust someone because their face is animated, these kind of things we need to be aware of because this is why the glib charm of sociopaths and psychopaths actually works on people. Right. And if people are aware that the mask, that social politesse that we use to lubricate our social engagements and interactions actually opens us up, makes us vulnerable to real danger. So this belief that people had that the politesse of society is actually a positive thing, it is, but with careful context, you know. And it is so important that people learn to recognize these things and develop the objectivity to see the contradictions in individuals that they don't want to see. Presidential candidates are the absolute best example of this. And in my opinion, it's a matter of deliberate engineering. That they engineer even. I wouldn't be surprised if these histories aren't even real, that they're just fabricated. That may be going a little far. I don't know. But you could use Donald Trump being marketed as the answer to Epstein-type predators. And then it turns out that he's in the files 38,000 times or whatever. He's like the most mentioned name, right? That's not a coincidence. And if you still think it is, just start going back down the line of presidents and you'll see these absurd contradictions in every single one of them, including the candidates. Kamala Harris, right? She was marketed as a pillar of integrity. When she was the Attorney General of California, she kept inmates past their release date, which is insane, a totally illegal human rights violation, civil rights violation, all messed up. Not only that, the overcrowding was so bad in California prisons at the time that one inmate was passing away from unsanitary conditions every week, and some of them had like 6-month sentences. So it's really not fair if somebody has a nonviolent charge and a short sentence, and you're going to put them in conditions that are lethal. You know, and she's aware of this, and it got so bad because she refused to do anything and they argued this. This is not an assumption. Her office actually argued that they were a source of cheap labor. Therefore, they wanted to release some nonviolent offenders with short sentences in order so that people would stop dying, right? And she's like, no, they're a source of cheap labor, right? Which is insane, considering one not innocent exactly, but one inmate that may have not have done anything really serious, it could be a pot charge, is dying. She fought the Supreme Court, and then when they made a formal injunction against her, she ignored it for 3 fucking years. Meanwhile, people are dying, and eventually a 3-panel judge stepped in and intervened and forced her. And then when she was confronted about it during her campaign, she said she had never heard of it until after she was Attorney General, and she was horrified when she was informed, which is absolute lying through her fucking teeth. Speaking of psychopaths, that's just crazy. But you could go with Biden too. Oh, and then she said she believed all of Biden's victims. She said that she was concerned about his Klan connections. And then 2 weeks later, when she was nominated, she said it's an honor to serve beside this great man. Everybody's watching this happen, right? All the Democrats watch this happen. And when I would bring it up to them later, they acted like, what are you talking about? That's not real. I'm like, I know you watched that debate and you saw all this go down. This is a beautiful example of why we all need to do this work. Because all of this nervous system or neural filtering, neural gating, predictive processing, this ventral vagal complex that allows psychopaths and sociopaths to charm people. Conscious attenuation of these mechanisms will make all that go away. And if you subscribe to the idea that dynamic systems theory rules apply to human consciousness as part of a distributed field intelligence, as nodes in a larger system, when you bring a node into coherence, it exerts an entrainment inducing or a pattern inducing influence on the field in the system globally that brings other less coherent nodes into coherence. So when you do this work on yourself, you are globally affecting the whole system at a subtle level. The thing is, it's not that subtle. Coherent nodes exert, like, it depends on the system and the magnitude of the the node or its amplitude or whatever the proper word is. But 100 to 1,000 times the influence of more entropic or decoherent nodes, right? So we have a tremendous amount of power to exert an invisible influence positively on the sleepwalking muggles. And that is so inspiring to me, considering that we are at a point where debating and arguing and interfacing, with articulation is not really possible anymore. People have become so entrenched in their default mode network, and that's actually a consequence of the propaganda largely, because the way that it works with this inversion protocol is when you have maximum contradictions. I wrote a piece about this on Substack, and I think I did a live stream where I read the entire thing with commentary. Oh, I also posted it as a video with some nice storyboards and whatnot. So check that out if you want to get deeper into this. I'm going to move on in just a minute. But this inversion protocol, propaganda protocol, serves a sort of dual purpose. The more you have to engage, the more you use it, the better the thing becomes, just like a muscle, right? So when you are bombarded with these incredibly insane contradictions, you become actually more entrenched and more rigid in your thinking and more in your lane. But within that lane, as long as your fundamental tribal identity isn't threatened, you're more malleable. So they can stick you in a sort of rigid observer window, but then they can make your values, for example, are more manipulable. Like when I was a young liberal, we hated that the right supported censorship. And all it took for the left to change their mind about that, after decades of it being a fundamental value, was for like 2 or 3 major politicians, Hillary Clinton and Al Gore, I think it was, to say we need censorship, and they just all pivoted like it was nothing. Because the values are really performative more than they're actually, it's largely theater. If you do this work that I'm describing beyond the therapeutic application or benefits, that susceptibility to mind control, really, it just vanishes, disappears. And this is why, by the way, Hermeticism has been labeled as evil. The Illuminati were really basically a Hermetic organization, the original Bavarian Illuminati. The Freemasons' original mission, whether they have adhered to this is extremely doubtful, but traditionally it was supposed to be a compendium of a collection of all of this type of knowledge, mostly Hermetic. Yeah, all of those type of organizations were really basically Hermetic mystery schools. And that's why they've been demonized, because the last thing that the establishment wants is for people to figure out how empowering those systems are, right? They reframe esoteric knowledge from superstition to an advanced understanding of natural principles and psychology. That's really fundamentally what the mystery schools are actually about. And historically, you can see concrete evidence of this because when the pharaoh, I think it was Akhenaten, recognized that the mysteries, that initiation transform people into sovereign beings that had access to pattern recognition abilities that really they didn't need institutional education or directives from a pharaoh or any of this stuff, and that they also wouldn't tolerate it because when you're aware that you don't need to be ruled, it's an indignity, right? This is something that you have earned, and it's kind of an insult to tell you that you are not sovereign. So Pharaoh banned them, and he created a monotheistic religion. And then when the Roman consulate realized that the mysteries were a problem, they banned them. They sent magistrates called archons in to steal the knowledge and to subvert the organizations. And then they created Christianity and imposed that upon the people in place of the mystery traditions. And then in Europe and elsewhere in the modern era, they've been demonized. That's what's really happened here. Basically, man had the truth and found error. And what we need to do now is reintegrate truth to reestablish coherence as a baseline rather than an anomaly in society. Let me check in with the chat one more time. So, am I saying that behavior modification through shamanic organic psychedelics is a necessity to accomplish this level of healing? Um, I mean, I wouldn't want to frame it as a necessity, but the syncretic synthesis of really Hermeticism, speaking of, is a really sophisticated shamanic tradition. Right. So if we're going to include all of those types of traditions, well, another way to explain Hermeticism is to say that it's shamanism that is integrated with scientific awareness and intellectual development as a priority. Right. So you're not going to do better than that. There is concrete evidence in favor of this. The most transformative experiences that people can have on a neurophysiological level, measurable changes and behavioral changes that are consistent and lasting, even IQ enhancement, so many benefits that come from psychedelic experiences. There's nothing else that's comparable, not meditation or there's nothing. And that also applies to conventional therapeutic modalities. Psilocybin is 85% is the number that appears across the board for some reason, but for treating addiction, 85% more efficacious than conventional modalities. And by the way, I was run out of NA years and years ago. I had to go because of parole or probation or something. But I got run out of there for suggesting that ayahuasca could help people. I hadn't even consumed it yet. It was just from the research. I was aware of the research on it. And they were outraged that I would say that in an NA meeting, right? But it turns out that the founders of AA and NA, one of them at least, left at launch because the 13th step was supposed to be an LSD trip, because he said that way people will actually graduate and they can go on to live normal lives. And I think that the other individual, for whatever reason, they actually want to keep people trapped in there. It's not good. It's definitely not good. AA and NA are not good for people. The idea that you are sick and you are permanently sick and that if you ever slip, you're going to go off the rails. And I mean, I've had, when I was younger, drug habits, definitely did too many drugs. I didn't tend to get addicted to any particular thing, but I was definitely high all the time and too high and sometimes on bad stuff. But once I healed not all of my, but a majority, a sufficient percentage, of my trauma, um, I could dabble in those things and have no inclination to go overboard or, like New Year's Eve or something. And it's completely different than it was when I was younger. So I really think that telling people that, convincing them of that, if they do slip up, they're going to go off the rails because they believe they're going to. It's not good. I do not recommend AA or NA at all. So where were we with this? Survey is a vagal tone biomarker. It's not that important. Interoceptive accuracy and anterior insula, not really. Okay, we talked about the default mode network, I guess. Self-directed neuroplasticity, and this is extremely important, and it's also really mind-blowing that it's even a thing. The fact that we can consciously change wiring in our brain just by thinking about it, and that there are states of mind, there are even ultrasound oscillation therapies coming out of Stanford and Johns Hopkins based on golden ratio proportions, the oscillations that restore coherence in the brain. So without any direct interfacing of any kind, you can eliminate decoherent or interference patterns from your brain, which is just absolutely remarkable. And there are all sorts of multi-domain implications of this, right? But the self-directed neuroplasticity means that your brain somehow understands, you don't know necessarily, but it knows where the neural hub is that you are focusing on re-engineering when you're thinking about it. And it has the capacity to do that when it receives these directions, which is, I find that really extraordinary. So Dr. Jeffrey Schwartz developed the concept of self-directed neuroplasticity working with OCD patients at UCLA, demonstrating that mindful self-observation without medication could produce measurable changes in PET scan brain activity comparable to pharmacological treatment. This is another reason all of this has been so suppressed, and it is also one of the reasons that people that dog on AI are, it's not the tool, it's the fool. And that is a foolish position to take, because the reason this information is accessible to the common person is AI, basically. Yeah, that's hugely important, in my opinion. The fact that sound healing now has actually been substantiated in research that, sorry, my son just screamed. The ultrasound therapy is mindfulness as an actual treatment. This is an incredible threat to a lot of industries. The pharmaceutical industry has tried to get its talons into psychedelics by creating non-psychoactive versions of LSD and whatnot. And that is so unbelievably dangerous, because you are sort of stripping the transcendental element out of it, and there is direction that comes from, well, it's the entrainment, right? Well, you have a sense of something guiding you when you take mushrooms or ayahuasca. And if you don't necessarily believe that it's a plant spirit, when the default mode network is it's attenuated. Sorry, my son crying out there is I just looked at the screen and it says refocus. He's just distracting me a little bit. I'm sure he's fine. It's probably just his mom putting him in bed. What the hell was I talking about, though? It was important. something about the default mode network getting. Here, let me look at the heading, and I can probably get myself back on track. Either way, I mean, I'm sure I was close enough that you guys probably got my drift. I'll have to look back at the stream later and maybe edit the rest of that thought in there. But yeah, so the model has 4 steps. Relabel, recognize the intrusive thought feeling as a brain event and not a fact. Reattribute it to a disorder or pattern and not the self. Refocus or direct attention toward a constructive behavior. Revalue, reduce the weight given to the unwanted signal over time. The deeper principle is user-dependent plasticity. The brain reinforces what it repeatedly does. So every time you respond to a trigger with an old maladaptive pattern, you strengthen that pattern's neural pathway. Every time you introduce even a brief pause, a metacognitive gap, you are literally building an alternative pathway. Over time, deliberate attentional practice creates structural changes. This is the mechanism underlying why integration work after a psychedelic experience matters so much. The neuroplasticity window is open, but what you do with your attention during that window determines whether new pathways form or old ones reconsolidate. And this is another example of that kind of validates intuitive intelligence, right? Because the indigenous will say, at least the ones that I worked with, that the medicine stays with you for 3 days, 5 days, 7 days, 10 days, depending on how many ceremonies you've had and the dosage and everything. One of the ways of interpreting that is that the neuroplasticity remains enhanced for some duration after the experience. So you have this window of opportunity to build these structures into your life, so that you don't necessarily have to rely on psychedelics. I am not really a person that promotes a minimization of use. During certain periods, I use a lot of psychedelics really often, and it does nothing but help. I mean, I use them within a certain context and with a lot of experience and a protocol, but I just didn't want that to be taken like I'm saying, you should get the message and hang up the phone like some people say. The potential, once you move beyond trauma as the focal point, shifts to creativity and self-expression and self-actualization. And psychedelics are generally going to support that for the duration. Our imagination and the potential that is innate in our consciousness, in our brain, is infinite or near infinite. And the fact of the matter is, just as you can't run an Apple program on a Commodore 64 from 1981, you have to upgrade your hardware in order to run better software. So the neuroplasticity and the neurogenesis, there is going to be a symmetry threshold, I guess, or there's going to be an omega point is a better word, where maybe the brain can't really become any more. In fact, neuroplasticity past a certain point is actually counterproductive. Anyways, all of this stuff, there is information about the specifics. Like, for example, with psilocybin, you shouldn't really exceed 2.5 grams, except for on those like rare occasions where you really need like deep transformation, because there's a point of no returns in terms of neuroplasticity. It actually starts becoming, how do you say, where, it's diminishing returns. It's not even diminishing returns. It's diminishing. It's negative, in terms of neuroplasticity and neurogenesis. So, you know what I mean? You want to do that infrequently, and you need to be aware of these things. That's why I say the frequent use is good, but within certain contexts and with an awareness of certain guidelines and whatnot. So let me check back in with the chat, see where we're at. Imagination more important than knowledge or equally important? Everything is equally important. In the Hermetic tradition, we would say that you need to balance the pentagram. which means that basically the Hermetic philosophy has to do with embodying universal principles and mimicking them or reflecting them as closely as possible in your systems that you build and in your own life. Right? So in the universe, every particle has an antiparticle that is an exact opposite, but the same mass and charge and everything. And so when you receive a blessing, you know that you have to watch out for the curse that is the antinomy, because everything contains its contradiction. Otherwise, it would not have structural integrity, right? So imagination and knowledge, another way of putting that is intuition. And that is exactly the core of my entire protocol, that intuition has been devalued in our culture, and people that have attempted to redeem it have actually made the situation worse, because they believe that spiritual development is antithetical to intellectual development. And they will also tell you that this world is a reflection of the spiritual world. So if you see reason in the finite everywhere around you all the time, why would you assume unreason in the infinite? That doesn't make any sense. It can't be both. If this is a reflection of that world, then, so, there's more to it than that, of course. There is the fact that real magicians of the mystery traditions didn't just learn, they weren't polymaths just because they wanted to be able to manipulate systems and understand dynamics and whatnot, to triangulate their objectives with circumstances in such a way that the fulfillment of their will was as, like an equation. That's well, that is why they were doing it. But it's not the entire reason. You have to have excellent critical thinking skills. You have to make a friend of reason in order to protect yourself as you expand your consciousness. You want your head above the heaven and your feet below the hells, equally up and down. Another way to think of it is that if you are just having mystical transcendental experiences and you're not balancing that with grounded intellectual development, you are just creating an imbalance, and you're not really going to gain much from it. You might feel more at peace, but I would have to say that the people that I see that push themselves the hardest in the direction of mysticism and spirituality and whatnot without the counterbalance are some of the most, they're the most muddle-headed of mystics. The imbalance is totally observable. So this is actually also something that is not, it doesn't help me much with marketability, because people don't want to hear that. People want a magic pill. They want a quick solution. They don't want to deal with things they perceive as tedium. And my position is that intellectual development is not tedium. It's only tedium because you have some sort of predisposition to perceive it that way. For me, it's like sex or playing a musical instrument or anything else. There is no, like learning trigonometry is fun. And if you pay attention to the way that your cognition changes as you absorb information with that kind of depth, and it's complex, but it's very fundamental to the universe and our experience. So rather than thinking in a line, you can think more easily in differentials. And the benefits of learning calculus, it is not just about the applications of the equations and whatnot. It is going to change. It's going to improve your art. It's going to improve you as a lover. It's going to improve your emotional nuances, and your ability to respond with subtlety and, you know, um, yeah. So you have to develop all of these things in perfect isomorphism, I guess. Okay, so earlier I mentioned how formal training, and this is something that has there have been independent evaluations of my, I guess, performance that have come to this conclusion. It's not just like me evaluating myself at this point. And also, I'm going to show you guys there's lots of research on it. It doesn't necessarily mean that any untrained person is going to be adept at this kind of stuff. It takes a lot of circumstantial alignment, I guess, and cognitive predispositions and whatnot as well. You know, this is to relate it back to shamanic practices. This is one of the reasons that the popularity of spiritual practices, concepts, shamanism, especially, I think, that there is no way, or we don't have systems in place to evaluate people. And I don't necessarily mean in an institutional sense, even. In the mystery traditions and shamanic lineages, there's just a person that can tell whether you're there or not, you know. And what I see, especially living here in PSOC or near PSOC, most of the individuals that work in this industry, I guess, they learn a vernacular and it's completely hollow and vapid, but they just learn to parrot things that they see other people saying and doing, and that sort of suffices for, I don't want to say credibility, but or aptitude, or you know, so it is kind of sloppy territory, uh, but again, we can negate the need for those kind of services entirely if people actually take the responsibility to develop themselves into sovereign beings upon themselves. Not everyone can do that, and a lot of people need guidance at first, at least. And I do offer consultations. We do have retreat events that are still open from fall to August, or sorry, September through November, possibly December. So if you're interested in that, shoot me an email. Please hit the like button, share, subscribe. Consider becoming a patron. We're demonetized if you find value in this content. I don't get paid by YouTube or anyone else but my community to produce it. And I want to thank those people that are patrons and supporters. My Substack account has started to grow again. I'm really happy about that. It's a great platform. Becoming a paid subscriber there is the best thing to do because I actually like giving money to Substack. That's how they make their money. There's no advertising. They just get a percentage from the paid subscribers. They don't censor. It's just the last place on the internet that I feel has any value and, you know, free speech. And it's full of brightly shining, iconoclastic, neurodivergent, innovative, open-minded academics and academic level thinkers that are not academics. And, you know, it's a good fucking place. Let me check in with the chat before we move on to our next area. What is going on here? Sweet dreams plants harvested during the fall. What is that? I'm not familiar with that one. Yeah, Substack guys. Was I going to respond to something in the chat? Yeah, I'm not familiar with the Sweet Dreams plant. Okay, so the gap between propositional knowledge, what you can learn from textbooks and clinical training, and tacit knowledge, what accrues through lived embodied experience and cannot be fully articulated or transmitted didactically. Philosopher Michael Polanyi called this the irreducible dimension of genuine expertise, the part that cannot be codified and only cultivated. Evidence-based medicine's own critics acknowledge that clinical judgment is fundamentally impossible without tacit knowing, and that formal training alone is an epistemologically insufficient account of what a skilled practitioner actually does. People that are in the profoundly gifted range, running ahead of or being consistent with research without academic training, is a well-documented phenomena in expertise science. Expert intuition is pattern recognition. Studies on elite decision makers show that experienced practitioners in high feedback environments build massive internal libraries of perceptual chunks, allowing them to recognize configurations instantly that novices cannot see at all. Crucially, this pattern library is built upon experience with feedback, not from study, which is exactly the distinction that we're making here. The 10 plus years of working in this domain, receiving real feedback from real human outcomes, has helped to build a form of knowledge that no formal curriculum can replicate in the same time frame. And it also has to do with, like I was saying earlier, the internal experience of having been through a cluster of morbidities, right? The self-esteem damage, depression, bipolar disorder with intermittent psychopathy based on triggered, triggers. I'm sure there's more. So you have to have gone through all of these things personally in order to really be effective in assisting others to transcend them. So, for example, Carl Jung is widely regarded as like the great genius of modern psychotherapy. I think he was batshit crazy half the time. Not really. I mean, I'm exaggerating, but he had 2 periods of really extreme disassociation. And interestingly, just as I did, he reported a lot of synchronicities and non-ordinary cognition experiences during that time period. And I think that what those periods are, Robert Anton Wilson, I believe, came up with the name Chapel Perilous for this experience where these things happen. In dynamic systems theory, we would call it a bifurcation manifold or crossing a symmetry threshold, right? It's not really an ego death, but it is a sort of a node in the developmental trajectory of the individual where the system either decoheres completely or it decoheres temporarily and then comes back together, recurses at a higher layer. Just like in music, when you reach the 7th degree of the scale, of the 8-note scale, including the octave, there is a perfectly symmetrical scale, the diminished, and there's no tonal center. And it also gives you more options to resolve than any other mode. By far. So it's a really interesting thing. It's also interesting to consider that it consists of devil's intervals stacked. The chord is Diabolus in Musica, just stacked on top of each other. But yeah, I'm just pointing that out because this thing of recognizing the fact that there's this one architecture that underlies everything is so fundamentally important. It can literally unlock genius in a person who is otherwise of average IQ, to really understand this and put it into practice. So peer support, lived experience, it's not just philosophically defensible. There's a growing body of research supporting it operationally. Peer support specialists, individuals with lived mental health experience and no formal clinical training, have been extensively studied. Systematic reviews consistently find peer support improves self-reported recovery, empowerment, hope, quality of life, and social functioning. 9 out of 10 clinicians surveyed believe peer workers add value to mental health outcomes. One-to-one peer support is at least as effective as clinical-only staffing models on key outcomes. Peer-developed programs show statistically significant improvements in emotional identification, supporting others in distress, nonverbal communication, and social connectedness. The U.S. Surgeon General has explicitly called for expanding lived experience practitioners in mental health services. The mechanism is well theorized. Social proximity, shared experience generates trust, rapport, and relational safety that formal therapeutic distance cannot. This is not a consolation prize for lacking credentials. It is a distinct, irreplaceable mode of therapeutic action. And the wounded healer, we're going there next, of course, but it's more than that. And this is something that Jung actually recognized, that he considered his intuition his primary diagnostic tool. And again, this is something where abuse can lead to these kind of cognitive abilities, because borderline personality disorder people generally can read people just, like they're just taking the entire contents of your being out and like reading it in a second. And I'm accused of that constantly. In fact, people have told me it can be difficult to be around me once you realize that I see through everything, and that your mask means nothing. And, I know if somebody touched you as a child as soon as I meet you, and it's true. You ask any of my clients ever, I know whether their mom is a narcissist, I know so much about people, and it can be just from, I don't even need to see your body language. Just as soon as I have an imprint of the individual, I know all kinds of stuff for absolutely no reason. And consistently, it's a really weird thing, but it's definitely real and true. And I don't think, this is one reason I don't think that training to become a shaman necessarily is appropriate. I think people are born that way, probably. Although I do think that if you have if you have undergone this other process, then something along those lines is on the table for everyone, but it's not, I don't want to frame that as like a traditional shamanic apprenticeship for a person that hasn't already gone through the process of bringing themselves into greater coherence and dealing with a lot of cultural influences and baggages that an indigenous person is not going to have when they start the shamanic training. If that makes sense. The wounded healer archetype. Jung coined the term wounded healer specifically to describe the dynamic, this dynamic. His colleague, Marie-Louise von Franz, wrote that the wounded healer is the archetype of the self and is at the bottom of all genuine healing procedures. The idea is that the healer's own unresolved wounds cause the resonant field in which another person's transformation becomes possible. Create the resonant field in which another person's transformation becomes possible, not despite the wound, but because of it. Okay, so think about that. That was a direct quote from Jung. And I have been talking about my concept of us as nodes in a holographic information system, and that our coherence results in bringing other people into coherence, and the fact that without the hole in the soul where the light comes through, you don't know how to do that. So the damage is a prerequisite for the healing ability. But that's the same thing as saying decoherence coming into coherence and trains with the rest of the field and brings other people into coherence, right? Even in the jungle with the ayahuasca, one of the things that we do, traditional healing modality in the Shuar practice, at least, and I think it's pretty universal, has to do with the ayahuasca allows us to see a sort of energetic grid around an individual. And there are, if you've ever seen plastic that's been burned and it like turns kind of black and it shrivels. If I had a little piece of something, I would burn it, but there's nothing around. But you guys probably know what I mean. It looks like that where there is decoherence. And you can use sound and other tools to stitch those fragmented areas up. And when you do that, the person will almost inevitably run out of the maloka and vomit, or if they have a bucket, then in there. But I prefer to have people go outside for a lot of reasons, but subject for another time. It's a real thing, and it is something that we are actually starting to be able to scientifically validate, which is really incredible. And I realized that these were not hallucinations the first time I took LSD. In fact, I think the second time, I guess. And the second time that I took LSD, I realized that consciousness was a field phenomena, right? And when I started apprenticing, um, I realized that those patches I was seeing, and I'm talking about very early on, actually before I was apprenticing, I guess it was in the probably the third or fourth ceremony. Um, I was, I saw the trauma, the decoherence in the field, and the shaman walked over and looked at it, and he was doing something with the feather and blowing some soap play, and I realized we both can see that. So that was the first inclination I had that these things actually worked. And the next thing was when I brought a friend with me, and she suddenly started screaming bloody murder. And with a flick of a wrist and some water, the shaman was able to, she instantly stopped screaming, and he had to grab her and throw her. It was a teepee. He had to grab her and throw her out of the teepee because he knew she was going to projectile vomit immediately. So I started to see these things, and I realized this is not anyone's imagination. Not that I really thought that it was going in, but I need objective proof. That's part of the protocol of scientific illuminism. We don't want faith. Faith is not helpful. Certainty is not possible. But it is you can be reasonably certain about things. And you have to approach the metaphysical, the esoteric, the spiritual with the same kind of cognitive evaluation protocol that you would any other domain of your life, because there's no difference. It's a holographic information system, and it's all the same thing. It's one thing, really doing one thing in a bunch of different modalities, I guess. Let me check in one more time with the chat. Check out Travis Bodick's book, The Plant Remedy. I might have read that. Call my bluff and tell me where to send your plant. I'm in Peru. I don't think you can, honestly, unless you happen to be. If money doesn't matter to you anymore, feel free to support the channel. We really appreciate that. Okay, so where were we? Wounded healer therapists demonstrate stronger empathy, deeper attunement, and greater capacity for authentic connection with clients. The risk is what Jungians call inflation and splitting, unconsciously projecting the wounded pole entirely onto the client and positioning yourself safely outside it as a pure healer. This is the archetype shadow, not incompetence, but unexamined identification with the healer role that can blur boundaries or create dependency dynamics. Yeah, I mean, there's all kinds of slippery slopes there. I have seen ego inflation as a consequence of DMT and ayahuasca more so than any other psychedelic. And because people go into it with the expectation that it's going to do the opposite, there is like an enhanced selective perception pathology that can emerge. Or selective perception that results in a pathology, I guess. I had another level of that. Yeah, that's enough, I guess. Self-diagnosis is not inherently invalid. It is methodologically weak when it is not cross-validated. You need extensive research, real-world feedback, and emergent outcomes. The issue is how you frame it. So the language that we use, uh, rather than diagnose, prescribe, or treat, we facilitate experiences, support integration, offer consultation, and hold space for processes that the client themselves is undergoing. And this framing is not just legal protection and it's not just rhetoric, it's more accurate to the actual practice. The medicine works, and you are a sort of mediator, like a Hermes at an individual's crossroads. Uh, and formal structures likely would have blunted my own development, specifically those that impose diagnostic frameworks as the only lens. But this cuts both ways. The most credible version of autodidact is someone who has done more rigorous informal study than most credentials practitioners, not someone who rejects rigor. And that is really important to understand. And that is what I think the fundamental problem with the ayahuasca industry at large. It's one of the main, and not, any kind of alternative modality of healing, because people will embrace, and I don't mean this to demean the traditional practices, but in the context of someone that's coming from a modern society with NPD mom and a borderline mom and an NPD, you know what I mean? And then all of the other, the complexity and sophistication of the traumatic influences, and it's just, you need a different kind of context in order to really establish, to bring your internal self into homeostasis. Uh, and it's true that when we talk about how the people that have gone through the traditional routes, that the self-motivated practitioner and autodidact often, if not always, actually has more hours of research and current research under their belt than people that have degrees and certification, because once they get their degree, they're satisfied with that and they begin their professional career. In my case, I did not ever intend to make this a business when I started the journey. It was about helping myself, and the other aspect of my life purpose I perceived as trying to help society as well, to incorporate the things that I was learning that were fixing me. And also, whatever I recognized, that whatever it was my brain was doing that is unusual is missing in a way that is less than ideal, So the point that I'm making there is that I occasionally at this point will engage with leading neuroscientists on Substack. On one occasion, I'm not going to say his name because I feel like it might be rude, because it isn't exactly flattering. But I got into an argument while he was at some major conference in Sweden presenting his theory of consciousness. And during this exchange, I mentioned non-neural cognition, and he didn't know what it was. And I mean, it's not necessarily that he didn't know what it was, but he was definitely not current on the research. He didn't know Michael Levin. And I mean, it blew my mind how obvious it was that this guy thought he was presenting a cutting edge theory, but he had sort of stopped in his in his as I was describing with they get their degree and their developmental trajectory doesn't any longer include staying abreast of cutting edge research and whatnot. I've seen that an awful lot, and it really surprises me. The reason that I'm constantly researching and studying and processing all of this stuff is because I can't help it. It's just my natural predisposition and orientation, and I think when it doesn't really matter what the domain is, if a person is doing something that's not consistent with their true will, they're not going to be as good at it as somebody that is. It doesn't matter how much training you have. And if you're lacking the gnosis, the actual experience, then all of the institutional training in the world is not going to do you a lick of fucking good. You're still going to be completely incompetent, you know? So, and then also something that we're going to get to as well. I realized a while back that when I have these subconscious insights and whatnot, they're never wrong. And that's a boast I can make because I have receipts for miles. They're never wrong. I'm wrong consciously plenty. That's not what I'm not saying I'm always right. But I'm saying specifically when these things emerge from my subconscious, they're always correct. And the reason is it's an algorithmic computational process, you know? And when I talk about the importance of developing the sort of cognitive hygiene and protocols around these things with pattern recognition and whatnot, that's kind of the core of the value of it. You know, it's not that you're going to be able to necessarily generate these things consciously, but there are things you can do to increase the subsystem crosstalk so you have better access to the things that emerge from the subconscious. And those things that emerge from the subconscious are just they're byproducts of computational processes. They are never wrong. But you have to cultivate the ability to, you have to cultivate the crosstalk, you know. You got to provoke some gossiping between the conscious and the subconscious. Yeah, so I want to be clear about what I am and what I'm not. I am not a therapist. And that lack of credential is not an oversight. I've watched formal training install epistemological cages in people who were genuinely gifted before they entered the system. What I offer is something different: extensive autodidactic research, a nervous system that has been through the terrain, and a track record of holding space for people who had given up on conventional pathways. The science I've cited is not decorative, it's the framework I actually think in. Um, and that's another interesting thing. I do the research mostly to give myself language for things that I already think. And that might sound pretentious, but it's just the reality. And that's what I mean about the value of developing this kind of these cognitive processes and meta programming the multidimensional self, but with a high degree of aptitude, because it's something that can very easily go wrong. As I mentioned earlier, the misaligned assets, you know, where you can develop these skills, but if you misapply them, then you create complications for yourself. I realized just this week, I mean, it's always an ongoing process, right? That earlier I referenced how if people just have like a kind of yuppie office worker personality, I distrusted them more than makes sense, right? Another level of that is that I have always really shied away from marketing and promotion and sales and all of those kind of things because it feels manipulative. And I know that logically that doesn't make sense. And it is definitely to the point that it's to my detriment, right? I almost can't even do it. And I'm forcing myself to do it more and more and more. You guys may have noticed. But it's because my mother constantly accused me of being manipulative, and I developed this, and she was extremely manipulative, and I didn't want to be anything like her. So I had these layers of early incentive, these priors that made me feel like if I'm doing anything that could be perceived as even remotely manipulative, that it's like evil and it's just off the table. And because I associate people with office worker personalities with sales and marketing and lying and manipulating, I've had this irrational aversion to those behaviors, even if they were in the best interest of the people that I'm providing the service to, you know? So it is a misaligned asset. But you see, I'm 47 years old and I'm still noticing this stuff and analyzing myself constantly because I've trained my brain to do that. And it doesn't mean, obviously, that you're going to notice everything right away, but it is extremely helpful and beneficial. One of the things that I think has also happened is that I've maintained my neuroplasticity in the way that like a 20-year-old has neuroplasticity. You know what I mean? I have not really crystallized into an adult in the conventional sense of the word. It's true that I also probably have arrested development from traumatic abuse as a child. So I aged behind the curve to a large degree. But to this day, my friends and people that I interact with socially tend to be in their 20s. And the reason I think is that I am still in that like seeking, exploratory, self-discovery kind of modality permanently. And if I try to sit in a room with a bunch of 45-year-old muggles or something, I don't know what the hell they're talking about, and I'm not interested in it. I don't want to, you know what I mean? It's not, it. I cannot relate to that. Um, and I don't necessarily think that we're supposed to age that way. I think that it is the result of monotony and just a general sort of soul sucking, like muggle culture runs on trivialization, and all developmental processes in the universe are recursive fundamentally. So your environment is creating. People say change comes with from within. That's true to a degree, but generally it doesn't. And for most people, it's entirely a matter of reflection, right? And I'm not even necessarily criticizing them because nature is engineered the way it is for a reason and because of reasons, right? But what we have to do is re-engineer the environment if we don't like in the human design system, they're called reflectors, right? If we don't like the way they're reflecting, it means that the system the environment that they're in needs to be re-engineered. It ain't going to suck itself, kids. The author, reach out, touch the quantum intelligence field. Checking the chat out, guys. Prohibited sin. I don't know if it's prohibited or not. But if it's alive, it probably isn't legal. If you just send some leaves, you could probably do that. And if you email me or pop an email in the chat, I'll get in touch with you about that. By the way, you guys, if you're just tuning in, I have consultation slots available. And I also have spots at our events in the Amazon rainforest in August through at least November, possibly December. So if you're interested in that, shoot me an email. Please hit the like button, share, subscribe, consider becoming a patron, and click the bell if you do, because I'm under the average in that metric, and that hurts my feelings. So please click that little bell so you get the notifications. A lot of people tell me they don't get my notifications even if they do turn the bell on. So, So this is kind of interesting. Carl Jung and his psychotic breaks. The shaman is a madman who has healed himself. So between 1913 and 1916, starting in the autumn of 1913, after his rupture with Sigmund Freud. By the way, one of the architects of modern propaganda is Sigmund Freud's nephew. And if there was a lot of influence, I'm going to write a Substack paper about this, but it really explains a lot of the architecture. The specifics of that architecture. Anyways, Substack article coming soon. Jung entered what he himself described as a state of overcompensated psychosis. In his own exact words, recorded in the Black Books and later in Memories, Dreams, and Reflections, which is a great book, he explicitly stated that he was not released from that feeling until August 1st, 1914. Meaning this lasted roughly 10 months of acute intensity with residual waves continuing for several years. That is exactly how I experienced it. And we are not on the same page in terms of categorizing it as a psychotic break. There are elements of it that are consistent with that, but I was not delusional. And the intuitions that I had voices in my head, but everything they told me to do turned out exactly the way they said. So what do you do when the voices in your head are always telling the truth? And I'm talking about like crazy improbable shit. Like I wanted to play with a certain legend, like top tier legend in the music industry. I received instructions from my intuition to go to a specific music store, sign up for guitar lessons, and someone would introduce me, and that's exactly what happened. So, that's ridiculous. And I have tons of stories like that. So that's not consistent with a psychotic break. That's something else. And anthropologists actually came up with a term for this, or what are they called? Anthropological psychologist or something along those lines. Came up with the term essential schizophrenia for the shamanic modality of consciousness, where there's this overlap, but there's reason that is intact. And I think that that's probably what Jung experienced, and we're going to get into the other consistencies with it, because he did report all of those same things. Waking visions of floods of blood covering Europe, later interpreted as premonitions of World War I. Okay, so one day during this period, I had this vision of a flood, and I was way up in the Rocky Mountains, but this voice said people are going to die, and there's this image, and it looked like the desert. And so also I was way up in the mountains, so I thought that there's nothing to flood here. There's no way this is going to happen. But my intuitions had been so spot on so many times, I thought, well, it's not going to hurt anything to go drive up into the peaks a little bit and go camp. I really didn't do it out of fear that the thing was actually going to happen, but I did know that it was true. But it didn't make sense that it was going to happen where I was, But I could see these dark clouds rolling in too, which I hadn't noticed when I had this premonition. So I get my girlfriend and my dog, and we go up into the mountains, and it barely rains, And then I go home the next day. I'm going to work, and I see the front page of the paper says flood in Pakistan kills like 3,000 or something. And in the vision I'd had, it was a desert that had flooded. And I thought it was true, but I just it wasn't my location, So that is a really interesting parallel there. Auditory hallucinations, hearing voices both internally and apparently externally. It's also worth checking out, if you haven't read this, Dr. Rachel Turetsky and Dr. Douglas Wingate wrote a book called, I can't remember, Eighth Circuit Ascension, Metaprogramming the Multidimensional Self. And there is a chapter that goes through the 8 circuits. And this is the Chapel Perilous circuit. The model was originally engineered by Dr. Timothy Leary, and then Robert Anton Wilson made contributions to it. Other influences in the book are Stanislav Grof and John Lilly. It's a really great book about metaprogramming and the 8th Circuit, the Leary system and whatnot. Compound hallucinations, simultaneously seeing and hearing personified figures like Elijah, Philemon, and Salam, with some voices felt in his mouth. Sensed presences, he wrote, I often had to cling to the table so as not to fall apart. He genuinely feared he was, in his words, doing a schizophrenia. Freud, writing to Ferenczi and Ernest Jones at the time, declared Jung crazy and mentally deranged to a serious extent. Jung biographers later called the Red Book the most convincing proof that Jung's whole system is based on psychotic fantasies and the work of a lunatic. No, it's not. And I think it was actually the second psychotic break that he had that was more Chapel Perilous than the first. Sounds like an actual, breakdown. The second one in the 30s, I think, was more of a Chapel Perilous kind of scenario. What was I going to say about that, though? The compound hallucination. Oh, sense presence. Okay, so one of the things that happens during Chapel Perilous, and this was so insane for me to read after I experienced it, right? And to think that there has been a model this advanced sitting around getting ignored because Dr. Leary came up with it, in academia is like, yeah, fuck that guy. You know what they actually did to him? They did integrate a lot of his ideas into, what would you say, like the mainstream academic narrative or whatever. model framework, but they wouldn't give him credit for it. It's just such a dickhead thing to do. But what I was saying is that part of the Chapel Perilous experience is to have entity experiences, and that happened with me. The thing is, they apparently turned my dog off. I had a pit bull that was sitting on the bed, and first of all, my girlfriend saw the thing before I mentioned it because I knew instantly, just don't say anything. We had a glass house. The front of the house was glass, so you could see outside. And I saw it run by the window, and it was like gray and translucent, 4 feet. It looked like a gray alien, but translucent, like a hologram or something. And so I just instantly thought, don't say anything and see if she does. And she goes, did you see that? And I had been through so much weirdness at that point. I was like, I don't even care. I'm going to bed. And I went back into my bedroom, and I laid down in bed, and the house filled with like this kind of bluish, faint, like crackling sort of geometric energy. And, I was just annoyed. And my pit bull was sitting on the end of the bed. And back when I was actively borderline personality, I've knocked out 3 people in my life. And when you knock someone out, they snore and their eyes roll up in their head, like really intense snoring and eyes rolled up and whatnot. And actually, I should mention that all 3 of those people deserved it. It wasn't actually a matter of me being borderline in those instances. They actually really asked for it. Really, like if you guys knew the story, which I'm not going to share right now, you would, thumbs up. But my dog, my pit bull, was sitting on the end of the bed, and he never had done this before. He never did it again. He just fell over, eyes rolled up in his head, snoring like he just got knocked out. And I was like, and my girlfriend said it, did they just turn the dog off? And I was like, I don't care. And I pulled the blanket up over my head and went to sleep. I never even asked her if she went out because she's like, I want to go out in the living room and, So the next day I'm driving around just doing errands and stuff. And every single person that I ran into described having interacted with one of these entities that night. Durango, Colorado, June 2010. Right? Completely different people. The only common denominator was me. They didn't know each other even. None of them did. Well, actually, I didn't interact with one of them. He had just left, and I stopped by my work to pick up my check, and I ran into the singer from my band who worked there out behind the place, and he's like, man, Topher, R.I.P. Topher, who was our sound man. He had let him borrow this Tool CD with a song about alien abduction, and he had never heard the CD before, and he said he only made it to track 10, and track 11 is about an alien abduction, and he had this encounter with this thing exactly like I described. So then a pot grower friend came over with his son. They both saw this thing. In that book, and in Timothy Leary's model from the 60s, it specifically mentions not only entity experiences like I had during this Chapel Perilous experience, but that other people oftentimes perceive these things. And seeing that with the rest of the description of the experience being so consistent with my own was incredibly fucking weird. That is a really difficult one for me to wrap my head around. And I always thought it's not necessarily that I think that it was a hallucination, but I also can't imagine actual aliens or interdimensional entities feeling like they should just like harass me and a pot grower and an ex-Mexican gangbanger cartel member. And, these were just people like, why? I always felt like there's something obviously happened, but those explanations don't make any sense. I still don't have a very concrete explanation of why one person piercing the veil and walking between worlds would result in people they knew having a parallel experience. But it happened. And it's been documented since the 60s, the same exact fucking thing with all of the other elements. So recent research, 2024 peer-reviewed study in Frontiers of Psychology by Inskara and Blom worked working from the newly published 7-volume Black Books, released in 2020, conducted a full phenomenological analysis and reached a careful conclusion. It was probably not a psychotic disorder in the clinical sense, but something rarer and more interesting, hyperphantasia. That is an old school word for the fucking Chapel Perilous experience, which is also called the shamanic crisis. One way to understand it is, or a symmetry threshold. Here we go again. The same basic architectural and dynamic blueprint underlying all systems, right? In the developmental trajectory of a person, there is a breakdown where there's no center of gravity, just like the symmetrical scale has no tonal center, right? It's exactly the same thing. And so a system has to have space in order to move, to reconfigure. So there is a breaking down before there's a solvet coagula. This is what the alchemists recognized. You know what I mean? It is ubiquitous. And by the way, this is a way, this as above, so below protocol is a way to recognize absolute truths, because when you find one, you will realize that there is not any system or scenario that the truth does not apply to. It will not happen. They're absolutely universal. Universal truths are universal. And there's tremendous power and utility in that kind of knowledge. So hyperphantasia is an extreme vividness of mental imagery, so vivid it crosses a reality threshold and becomes phenomenologically indistinguishable from actual perception. Only about 3% of the general population has this trait. The imagery operates in inner space rather than projected fully into the external world, which is the classical distinction from true psychotic hallucinations, but at the extreme end of the spectrum, that distinction blurs. And I have another example of other people being able to see this stuff. This one is crazy as hell. And it's a story that continues to develop to this day. I'm still finding things out that are just unbelievably weird. In fact, if you become a patron, if you watch the Kenneth Grant, oh, geez, I don't know which one it is. You should watch them all anyways, but it's not Starfire. I think it's the first or second one. Definitely the first or second one of the segment of that series. You see me find puzzle pieces in real time because I don't read these things before I do the reactions. So I'm doing this secret stream and you just see my jaw fall down and my eyes bop out of my head because I just cannot believe what I'm looking at. So 2010, I guess, during this Chapel Perilous period, I was summoned somehow to this conference in New Mexico at a hotel. And there was a Sioux Sundance chief named Golden Light Eagle. There was like a Hawaiian shaman that called the wind. May the wind blow to confirm the power of our prayers. And the wind blew rocks, little pieces of gravel, but it blew hard enough that gravel blew across the parking lot on command. All kinds of crazy shit like that with this group of people that were the hosts, I guess. All of them were like this. Grandma Chandra is a girl with cerebral palsy, I think, that can talk to you through other people and you can tell it's real. It was wild. So driving home from this event, I had this, like it's describing, it's not quite internal or external. It was kind of like in my mind's eye, but I could see through it. So I could drive and it wasn't in the way, but it was not in my head either. And it was almost just like a portrait of this geisha alien with these long spiraling black horns, kind of like a demon, but not, obviously it wasn't evil. There's nothing dark about it. And I got no explanation at all. And I was like looking at it like, wow, that's cool. But what the hell is the point? And it just kind of vanished. And it happened one more time. And then like 10 years later, I had been playing with this guy that he's often in the chat, What's up, Dustin, if you're watching? But we were playing guitar. No. First, it was my ex-girlfriend who had narcissistic personality disorder, and it's actually how I figured out what was wrong with my mother. It was from dating this girl who I just happened to connect with right before I saw my mother for the first time in 8 years, right? So things happen for a reason. That was insane. To date this girl for a year or two, and then randomly go back and see my mother, and I was like, holy shit. As soon as I walked into the room with her, it hit me like I had just, I was like, whoa, holy fuck. It all makes sense. Anyways, though, so, okay, the girl, I was practicing guitar, which is what I used to do all the time, still do probably more than I should. And, she just randomly said to me, sometimes when you're practicing, I can see this kind of silhouette of this like purple and white horned, like geisha looking demon thing. And I didn't put it together with that vision. It had been 10 years. I didn't even think about it. And I was like, she was kind of nuts anyways. And I didn't really think that much of it. uh, like, oh, Satan's my spirit animal or whatever. That's metal. And, but then a couple weeks later, I'm playing with this guy that doesn't even know her. And he, as we're walking out of the jam one day, he goes, man, I got to tell you something. 3 times now, I've seen this like purple geisha demon looking thing kind of hovering behind you when you're playing guitar. And I'm like, what the fuck? That's 2 people now. 2 or 3 weeks after that, I go to this bar to play with my band. And as I'm leaving, there was this Maori kid that came to all of our shows. And as I was walking by him, he's like, hey, man, this is going to sound weird, but when you're playing guitar, there's just like purple. And I'm like, yeah, I like the horns. And he's like, what, you know about this? So I'm trying to maintain my sanity. This is 10 years after the Chapel Perilous thing. There's, only like little residuals of that kind of. So what do you do with that? So then I guess 6 or 7 months after the last person reported seeing this apparition, I'm in Ecuador and I drink ayahuasca, and I'm walking back to the teepee from the toilet, and I see that geisha demon thing in front of me, and Pachamama says, do you remember this? And I was like, yes. And it hit me right in that moment. This is what those people have been describing. And Pachamama says, would you like to know what that is? And I said, yes. And she said, well, you know what superposition is, one particle in 2 places. Souls are like that too, because it's a holographic universe. And so this is you as you exist on a gas giant that didn't become a red dwarf star because of the gravitational dynamics of a binary star system. And I was like, what the fuck? I don't know if that's true or, and so it was serious as well, which was meaningful to me for a lot of reasons that have unfolded since. And I was given a bunch more information, but the important thing is that it occurred to me to check and see 10 days after the ceremony if what I was told about those gravitational dynamics, because I have never read so much as an article in astrophysics. I don't care about astrophysics. It's not even a layman's article, not one time. I should know nothing about it. And when it occurred to me to check, I noticed that the research paper had been published 3 days earlier, and the ceremony where I received the information was 10 days earlier. It's important to note that information did exist in the field somewhere. It's not like because at first when I realized that it was correct, I was like, okay, that's hyper specific. I must have, the universal mind, an alien download, whatever. But then I realized, and wait a minute, the researchers all knew this information just because they hadn't published the paper yet. They'd known about it at least like weeks, probably months, whatever, before publication of the paper. So the information existed in the field, and that's important to take into consideration. However, what the hell? And it's exactly the same kind of scenario that's described in the Chapel Perilous, where multiple people can perceive these entities that are actually really a part of just like the one person's microcosm, I think would be the best way to describe it. Yeah, Jung appears to have had hyperphantasia constitutively. So, as part of his constitution, he describes it from childhood and then deliberately trained and intensified it through what he called active imagination, intentionally inducing these states, sustaining them, and conducting dialogues with the figures he encountered. He was essentially doing high dose inner psychedelic work repeatedly for years, but with no external chemical catalyst. The critical distinction the researchers draw is that Jung's own definition of psychosis, a failure to contain and comprehend the content of one's experience in the context of one's own life. By that standard, his own, he did not become psychotic because he ultimately did integrate, contextualize, and transmit the content meaningfully. The breakdown produced the entire architecture of analytical psychology. See, that's the whole shamanic crisis. The crossing of the abyss, piercing the veil. We have all kinds of language for this in esoteric traditions. And there are, as I've been describing, some very distinct differences between a classical psychotic episode and these kind of experiences. I definitely was not crazy, and I wasn't really hallucinating or imagining anything, and the intuitions all turned out to be correct, no matter how insane they were. And I was doing things to test them. Like, I had a feeling I could just go drive my car to LA and talk to the drummer from Tool. 4 days later, I was standing in a parking lot talking to him. I did not use any resource to locate him, and a whole bunch of stuff like that. So the only time that it did present as any sort of aberration was before I really learned to ignore wish demons, which are our hopes and desires. And that is one of the reasons that a sort of hierarchical structure or some sort of training guidance during these processes is necessary. This is why the shaman has to apprentice. This is why the mystery schools had a hierarchical, not exactly hierarchical, but an inner and an outer order. And there were, initiatory stages and gradations, that you had to work your way through. But the reason for that is your own safety and to sort of facilitate your process, not hierarchical in the sense of control or authority. Exactly. So, but yeah, I did chase desires because I was flirting with confusing my wishes, and also it seemed like I was able to manifest whatever I thought about to a degree that was pretty insane. But I managed to stay grounded enough to cling to the shore that I didn't do that much at all. I didn't I was able to restrain myself from overindulging. And okay, let's put it this way. Aleister Crowley said that the biggest and most common mistake that every burgeoning magician makes is to think his magic can do more for him than it can. And this is why that reason and analytical cognitive hygiene, all of this kind of protocols and stuff are so important if you're really planning or intending to go through an intense and deep transformational process, because you are going to hit a bifurcation manifold, a symmetry threshold in your developmental trajectory, and there's not going to be a clear center, right? So, you really have to be prepared for that. And something that I've realized for myself is that preparation for me started at birth practically. The universe has always been a sort of interactive dialogue kind of scenario for me. I have never had any trouble. I still to this day don't know if I believe in God in the conventional sense, but some sort of distributed intelligence that has at least a way of communicating with us that is architectural, if not agential. That's always been just undeniable for me. So, when I talk about how there are aspects of this sort of role that I think you're sort of born into. because without this development of these protocols and mindfulness, that I started to develop as a child, I wouldn't have been able to navigate those spaces so cleanly. So it's really something to take into consideration, because any of you guys out there that are engaged in this process or will become engaged in this process, there's, especially if you're male, there's nearly 100% chance that you are going to make the mistake of overestimating what your manifestation powers are capable of, and how accurate your intuition is. There's almost always a period of ego inflation, that the degree of it can vary, but it's part of the process. You kind of have to, your mind gets blown in the literal sense, it expands until it pops. and that creates the space for the reconfiguration of the system, I guess. Let me check in with the chat again. The best truths are paradox. All truths are paradoxes. Topher Gardner from Biocharisma. I don't know if that's the Topher I don't think that's the Topher I was talking about. He was a printing press guy. Or no, printing. Yeah, he was what do they call him? The pressman, I guess. They run the printing presses and put ink in them and stuff. I don't know if that's even still a thing. I used to work at a print shop. It was kind of lame. So let's continue with this, and then I'm probably done because I'm very, very tired. And like I said, this is going to be a series, and it's going to continue to get more interesting. We'll dive into ayahuasca, how I got involved with that. It's another thing that I really think that my system benefited from. Not there was no profit motive. That was not ever the incentive when I got involved with these things. And it's not that I think that there's anything wrong with that as an incentive, but when people adopt a profession purely for their job, it's a job, unless it's something that is more practical or blue collary, even then, it sucks that people have to do things they're not aligned with fundamentally. You know what I mean? When you get into deeper water, there needs to be an authentic alignment. Otherwise, you're really playing with fire, I think. Speaking of that, consider becoming a patron. With the ayahuasca, it's something I started studying when I was a child, and when I got involved with it, my maestros to this day has never done a retreat. You will not find him online. There's no commercial presence at all, and his teacher, who I eventually was connected with as well, you don't see that. It's only through word of mouth. I didn't even know there was an ayahuasca industry. So when he told me, you're becoming a shaman and you need to learn all this shit and then recontextualize it for your culture, I was actually like, no, I don't want to do that, because I hated the body load so much from ayahuasca. I did not like the way it made me feel physically. So I was like, no, I'm not drinking this all the time for years. There's no way in hell I'm doing that. And, I feel like I already have the capacity that I need for the application that I'm, you know what I mean? Like my shamanic work in my context, I don't really feel like I need to add. And that wasn't true exactly, because there were things that I saw and experienced that are tremendously valuable. And also it has given me a tremendous asset in terms of tools to help other people and whatnot. And for certain applications, nothing rivals ayahuasca. Other psychedelics are not in the same category. It's a completely different thing. It is probably the strangest thing in the entire universe, or at least on this planet. Yeah, but the point is that I did not get involved with it thinking that one day I will do events. I didn't even know that was a thing, and it may not have been yet. I don't know. Let's see. It was like 20, 2012 or something like that. So it was just becoming a thing, I guess. I don't know. I mean, I don't really know when the ayahuasca industry coagulated out of the murky depths of the jungle, but anyways, okay. Let's go through Jung's other. Ow. I'm gonna have to be obnoxious and have a bit of this coca paste too, because I'm just getting too tired. I would just stop because I'm tired. I didn't sleep well last night, but I'm curious to to reread this. I missed the one line earlier when I was putting this together that really struck me. So, having noticed that, I'm wondering, is there anything else of that magnitude that I might have overlooked? So, before we get into the to Jung's Chapel Perilous, sorry, I'm looking for my water. There we go. Experience. Oh, what the hell was I going to say? Oh, there's a obvious problem with the whole model of if the solution to mankind's problems is that we have to become coherent nodes, which means fully realized individuals, at least with minimal decoherence, um, because that is the like ground state, or um, like the we're like the particles in the larger system. So if we want to minimize the amount of suffering in the system globally to that which is unavoidable because of the parameters of the system, we have to do that in the individual first, and that will recurse, I guess, in the you know uh, systems that we create and live in, exist in. So that requires a person to commit to their true will, their real fundamental purpose. Society doesn't have infrastructure to support everyone just following their inner being. My belief is that this is why NPCs exist, and why people that don't do that are they exist in like isomorphic homeostasis with the requirements of the system that they exist in. To rise above the dirt and grime, you have to add the right spice at the right time. And so, a global awakening, if you pay attention, you'll notice that as things become more automated and as the society evolves, more and more people are waking up. So I think the solution to that is architecturally integrated into the developmental trajectory of society. Right, that as we wake up, the system will be sort of modulating to facilitate the realization of the emergence of fully realized humans as the baseline rather than the anomaly. Right. And we have some responsibility to ensure that ground support, that infrastructure is there. That's our job to build that. Okay, so later in life, in 1944, after fracturing his foot and suffering a heart attack, Jung had a medically induced delirium in which he experienced geometric visual hallucinations, an out-of-body experience, and what he described as a near-death experience. He reported hovering in a space of great height, seeing the earth from above. These were clearly delirium state experiences rather than the earlier psychogenic ones, but they deepened in his convictions about the nature of consciousness. This is a good illustrative case for dynamic systems wounded healer scenario that I've been kind of painting. Jung had anomalous perceptual experiences that the diagnostic system of his era and even today's would likely pathologize as schizophrenia spectrum. His contemporaries did pathologize them. He navigated the territory, refused to suppress or medicate the content, and instead treated it as data, building a framework from the inside out that has proved more enduring and clinically useful than the dismissals of his critics were, for sure. He later compared the entire period to a mescaline experiment. And also during my own experience of this, I was not using a lot of psychedelics. I don't think that it necessarily precipitated it. I ate mushrooms probably 2 or 3 times in the entire 10 months. Just like Jung, it was 10 months. I think it is for everyone. The Circuit 5, Chapel Perilous. Another interesting thing, check this out. The way that these information system parameters or whatever transpose, right? In music, when you get to the 5 chord, there is the most stability and the most tension so far. The tension gets worse when you hit the 7th degree, but so far in the scale. And this is also where you pivot. You can either go back to the source, to the 1, or you can use the devil's interval to pivot into all these different keys and whatnot from there. So it is, again, Circuit 5 in that model, and it functions just like the 5 chord in Western music theory. So where were we? So yeah, there's an interesting parallel to my own experience. Anomalous inner experiences, the diagnostic system failure, and that is a reference to my earlier experiences with a therapist that told me that I was too smart and that therapy wouldn't work, and that she was afraid she was going to end up on the couch instead of me, pathologizing my intelligence and also basically telling an 8-year-old that therapy wouldn't work for him. So this woman was obviously not competent because both of those things were, I mean, again, I don't think she was wrong that conventional therapy wasn't for me, because I think it was really important that I navigated all this on my own. The Jung, he refused medication. He navigated it all successfully, came out the other side. And not everyone does that. Charles Manson is a great example of someone who got stuck, because almost all men that I'm aware of that have gone through this process either completely accept that, like, you realize that you're a fragment of the distributed intelligence, which you could call God, right? But then you confuse that with being actually the Most High, specifically incarnated. And it's not something that I ever really took seriously, luckily. I was a little bit too grounded, but I kind of flirted with it, and it didn't help that I had just started a band that was getting some attention, lots of girls, and I'd just been laid off, and I was like an out of shape 31-year-old former construction worker, and all of a sudden I'm getting all this attention and these sort of preternatural capabilities. People around me were noticing, everyone's putting me on a pedestal. So it was difficult. I was struggling to navigate this anyways. And then I had all these influences that were trying to make it worse. But I never fell all the way into that trap. But I know what it is, you know. And most males, I think, have this as part of the process. And some people fall all the way in there. And Charles Manson got stuck in the symmetry threshold where you're supposed to figure out, oh wait, no, I'm a fragment of this thing that might even be equal to the thing itself, as in the same way that cells are not, there's no hierarchy, it's just they're all cells, you know. That's what we are, like the constituents of the body of this, or the consciousness of this, or both, I guess. You know, you're supposed to figure that out and then move on. And Charles Manson did not. I'm Jesus and the devil, you know. And it's like, well, that's true in a sense. You know what I mean? That's when it stops being crossing the abyss and it becomes a psychotic break. Did Jung, let's see. So, okay. Precognition associated with, and here's the thing, just as in my case, where I've documented these things on YouTube over the years. So, you know, the wildest of the claims that I make on this channel, you can go back and watch live streams that have dates that are solid proof. Otherwise, I wouldn't say the shit. And I am working on actually consolidating them into a single video with the research that's been published and the dates and, you know, screenshots of the thing. I've hesitated to do that because it almost feels too much like boastful or something. But I realize it's just data and it's important, you know. So I gotta stop with that shit. I mean, humility is self-defeating at a certain point. Misaligned asset, right? Precognitive visions that are documented and datable. The most striking case is the World War I visions of 1913 and 1914. Between October 1913 and July 1914, Jung recorded at least 12 separate visionary episodes in the Black Books involving floods of blood, seas of corpses, destruction of Northern Europe, dead multitudes, and a voice telling him, "This will become real." I was told that the pandemic would occur. No, I wasn't told, actually. I just started talking about it. I said, they're going to, everything that happened. I don't want to even get too deeply into it because the algorithm's really hard on me. But everything that happened, and the reason I said was that it was a ruse to take people's rights away and to really get the totalitarian surveillance state entrenched and whatnot. And I was talking to the same guy that I talked to at work when I had the entity experience. That told me about what happened to Topher. And so I'm telling him this in my kitchen, and he goes, "When?" And I said, "The shit will hit the fan in 2020. No voice in my head, no reason for that. But I described the entire thing, the motivations behind it, and gave the year. And it sure as shit turned out to be true. So this scared the shit out of Jung. He was terrified that these were signs of his own impending psychosis. Same thing was happening to me. You know, even after things would turn out to have substance, these intuitions and whatnot, I still was like, man, I've got to just have lost my mind. It was really difficult. The programming of society, even on someone like myself, and this really helped me understand other people because I grew up pretty much entirely outside of society. I didn't really even have a public school education. I didn't have a lot of socialization. I didn't have TV in my house. I didn't start using the internet until 2010 or 11. And even then, very sparsely. You know, I would use it to like learn scales on YouTube on the guitar, and that's pretty much it. Even as recently as like 2014 or so, my bass player somehow was also like this, and we would need to know something, and we had phones, and it would not occur to us to Google it because we were just that out. We were that out of touch with technology. And so my point is that for someone like myself to have no religious indoctrination, very open mind, although I do very deliberately balance that with skepticism, You know what I mean? Like so little exposure to conditioning and struggle that much when the um, institutionalized, institution approved ontological model starts to break down. I'm still to this day, I'm really surprised at how difficult it was for me to accept that these things were real, even though I had intuited it my entire life. Of course, it's complicated in my situation because I had imposter syndrome and I didn't know what that was yet. And, there were a lot of elements to it, but still, I can imagine, or it made me more succinctly aware of the difficulty of liberating the minds of, more mainstream people because they had been so much more deeply exposed to it than I've been. And it's true that I feel like a lot of the things I see that aren't typically noticed are because of that lack of programming. At the same time, how much there still was, it was really shocking to me. Once I could look back and realize, like, damn, man, that shouldn't have been this hard. um, So he described in 1914 feeling a profound and disorienting relief. The catastrophe was external, not internal. He took the correspondence as evidence that his unconscious has been receiving what he later called transpersonal information, content that originated outside of his individual psychology. And that's how I've always thought about this. I've had apparent downloads of like Calabi-Yau manifolds and Fourier transforms and the Euler equation and D-branes and mirror symmetry and all this stuff, and I knew what all the terms were as soon as I saw them and assembled this thing, and then it was published by the Langlands program, shortly thereafter. But the information was already present in the field somewhere. It's not like I just came up with this stuff, I don't think, just from like genius or something. It's just resonant bleed or specific information that we occasionally can extract through non-ordinary cognition and pattern recognition. If it's really a fractal, you can zoom in on it and extract really highly specific information from that zoom, I guess is the best way I can describe it. Because all of the manifestations, articulations of the universal mind are just different. They're recombinatorial differentiation. That's what they're composed of. The same patterns in different juxtapositions and combinations and whatnot. So that might explain even these really highly specific extractions of information. It's a fractal, and if you can zoom in enough, you can get really specific information. Another way to think about this, and again, this is one of those cases that I'll put in this video where I can demonstrate. I've been talking about this for at least a decade, and now schoolers' new theory that's like 2025 or whatever, the now theory, is exactly the same thing. And also it's exactly the same as Levin's goal state attractor model in biology. So again, it's that transposition of this schematic or whatever to all across domains. But when I had this period of enhanced intuition, I mean, I still have it intermittently, but there are peaks, and I'm not alone in this experience. This is something that everyone describes. Robert Anton Wilson, Aleister Crowley, Huxley, myself, people that have this experience, there is a peak. Crowley claimed that he had two. And that's rough because in my case, I hadn't dealt with my damage enough to actually fully take advantage of it all, and I sabotaged everything. And it's kind of the point to your entire existence that your whole life is leading up to this. And I sabotaged everything because I was just still fucked up. imposter syndrome and just a lot of stuff. But yeah, it's pretty typical that there's like a peak period. But I always described it like I came in. I think I was born with a certain level of coherence, regardless of the trauma and whatnot. It kind of threw me off a bit. But I always had the same purpose and the same predisposition. I knew why I was on this planet, what I was supposed to do, and you know what I mean? That kind of coherence. And so even during the experience, I would explain to people that that's why I had access to this information, to non-ordinary cognition and such accurate intuition, was because I was aligned with my own personal goal state, and that was entrained with a collective goal state. And because meaning is architectural, your environmental trajectory and alignment, your experiential alignment, it's all sort of one thing, because it's a holographic information system where meaning is architectural, right? So Schooler's theory of consciousness, the way he frames this is that when you come into coherence and realize your purpose, there's a resonant coupling with higher order observer windows. And if your purpose is entrained with a larger goal state, that results in system priority and you're granted more access to information. The apex window, where the experiences of all of the lower order windows are funneled up to and concentrated and processed. Basically what we would call God, explained in an information systems theory context, will even occasionally zoom in on individual windows. And then you have it's not omniscient, not even the apex window, because the chaos in the system is real. So it's still probabilistic, but I got intuitive instructions that were so specific, and it would give me little minor details, almost just because the system wanted me to know that it was real. Things that were almost trivial, but like details would just get dropped in with the instructions. So I would know, okay, like I just lit a cigarette and my battery went out just as Phil Esch walked in the room, which is exactly what I was told. Intuitive, guidance or whatever. It was like, go down there, bring your amp. Phil will hear you play, but if you so much as light a cigarette, and it told me that I needed to stop because I was going to sing, and it was important that I didn't destroy my voice. It said, if you light a cigarette, this will not happen. So we stood out in the line. It was opening night of his Terrapin Station, this club, and I had the amp on because I had been playing it, and he was like 2 hours late and coming out of the building. And I was like, this is stupid, voice in my head, whatever. I shouldn't be playing along with these dumb games anyways. I lit a cigarette. Phil walks out the door and my fucking light goes out on my amp. I just immediately looked down at my amp and just watched the light go out, just like the voice said. And there was more to the story too. And I told my then wife about all of it, and she watched it all happen, including Phil. When he was walking down the line of people, he just stopped at me and stood and looked me dead in the eyes. Didn't say a word, didn't smile, didn't reach out to shake my hand, nothing. Just looked me dead in the eyes like he was disappointed with me, and then kept walking. And my wife was like, what in the fuck was that? But yeah, Schooler's theory is pretty much identical to my own intuitive understanding of like why that happens. When people awaken, we associate that with enhanced intuitive abilities. This is why. Because what awakening really means is achieving a greater degree of internal coherence, which results in resonant coupling with higher order windows out of necessity. Everything in the universe is under the jurisdiction of necessity. So, the system is triggered by your resonance. So the way that people talk about this in spiritual circles isn't wrong really either. It's just that the understanding it within mechanistic framing is just as valuable as knowing that it's resonance, right? So resonant coupling with higher order windows, entrainment, system relevance, because you're aligned with a collective goal state, you have more information access. This is the way your computer works. And it's not because it's a simulation necessarily. I don't think it is. What does that even mean, first of all? That's just a way to dodge creationism or teleology or some sort of distributed intelligence. Because if it's simulation, is it simulations all the way down? What you're saying is there's got to be some kind of intelligent creator. But people don't want to acknowledge the possibility of a God, so they're like, well, we must have done it then. Like, how Luciferian is that? You know? Oh, well, it must be an intelligent creation. It must have been us in the future or whatever. Like, it's ridiculous. So when we discovered electricity, we said the universe is electric. When we entered the industrial age, we said the universe is a machine. We enter the digital age, the universe is a simulation. Stop it, dumbasses. Of course, our systems are going to be recursive with the fucking thing that they're emergent from. Everything is. It doesn't mean that the thing they emerged from them. That, sorry, that was kind of off. But yeah, no, it's not off subject because it is important. That is not what I'm getting at with this at all. Of course, our systems reflect the system that they're fucking built on the architecture of. I mean, what are people so scared of, with acknowledging teleology or distributed intelligence, even an architectural intelligence? The not gaslighting, but the evasion is crazy. The cosmological constant, right? A p-value, chance. When it was determined that the cosmological constant was not chance by their normal metric, they just moved the goalpost by 10 orders of magnitude. Rather than just say, okay, there's an indication that there's some sort of distributed intelligence, at least architecturally, in the universe. They just moved the fucking goalpost. 10 orders of magnitude? That's a lot. And then it's not like they changed the p-value across domains just in this one instance. And then for everything else, the old value for not chance stayed the same. But it's just where they saw evidence of a distributed intelligence, they're like, let's just fucking move the goalpost, and not to across the room or the lab, but how about to the other end of the universe? That way this won't happen again, And then, of course, if you factor in all of the other constants and whatnot, the probability of chance, it becomes so infinitesimal that it's complete insanity. And I think I don't have to tell you, it's not very scientific to do that. That's not what science is supposed to do. You don't just change the parameters in order to accommodate your presupposition. You know what I mean? Like, what in the actual fuck? Let me check in with the chat, make sure I'm not talking to myself. What's going on, Athena? Guitar lesson tomorrow, right? Yeah, okay. By the way, you guys feel free to ask stuff and whatnot in the chat. Okay, so poltergeist type phenomena. This is something I don't really think I've ever experienced. Oh yeah, I have actually one time where it was like definite. Yep. Oh man, I almost forgot about that. So there was actually two things that maybe could during this Chapel Perilous period. I had just gotten a bootleg copy of Book 4 by Aleister Crowley in the mail, and it was photocopied, and some of the pages were photocopied blank. There was and other ones were not legible. And I don't know why, but there was a bowl that had some DMT in it sitting on the kitchen counter, and the book was right next to it. And I thought about those pages that were kind of illegible, and I know this because instead of closing the cabinet that was open behind my head, I moved my head around it for some reason, which it's weird, and I thought, why didn't I just close it? But I didn't. And I saw the book and I saw the DMT and I thought, I bet you if I took like a moderate dose, my mind could probably fill in the rest of the letters and I could read this fucking page. And so I hit the DMT and I'm looking at the book and I start seeing these like little blue lines kind of forming around and I'm like, maybe I need more. So I hit the DMT a little harder. And then I'm staring at the book still, and I realize there's a big black bold sentence right in the center of the page that you could read without any help from DMT and it said, the only tool you need is your consciousness. And I was like, son of a bitch, I'm a dumbass, look at me with trying to, and I already knew that too, and when I thought that at that instant, I heard this fucking wood knock and I thought, whoa, that was Satori. That was the knock of Satori. And then I thought, wait a minute, that came from behind me. And I turned around and the cabinet door was closed. And then I heard the pitter patter of little feet run away and go into the laundry room. And I was like, I guess some interdimensional being just slammed my cabinet door and just ran. That was where I was planting my pot plants back there in the... So, I'm not saying that there was actually some kind of entity that slipped out of the DMT realm or whatever, but it is true that cabinet door slammed shut on its own right behind my head. And the other instance, somebody gave me a Michael, the archangel candle, right? And one day, I walk out into the kitchen and we had these string lights in the kitchen and there were flies, like thousands of them covering the wires all the way through. It was not a hallucination. I went and got my girlfriend, my roommate, like, what the fuck is this? There was no rotten meat anywhere. There was not garbage. It was spotless in that house. I paid for a maid at the time. And my girlfriend lit that candle. It was big and fat. It was huge. And we went outside for like a 20-minute walk. We came back. The candle was burned all the way gone. It was just gone. There was no fucking wax in the thing, nothing, and all the flies were gone. That was weird. That was super, super weird. Anyways, so Jung documented 2 events from his 20s that he described as permanently altering his epistemological commitments. This experience typically happens to women at 22 and men at 31. So I'm surprised to see this occurred. Oh no, this isn't the Chapel Perilous period. He's just saying this other thing happened when he was in his 20s. Jung documented 2 events from his 20s that he described as permanently altering his epistemological commitments. A solid walnut table split down the middle with a loud bang in his family home, but for no apparent reason. 2 weeks later, a steel bread knife in perfect condition shattered into 4 pieces inside a drawer spontaneously with no mechanical cause. He had these fragments examined by a cutler who confirmed the steel showed no defect. He kept the pieces for years. These events directly catalyzed his interest in parapsychology literature, leading him to read 7 volumes from Swedenborg and extensively study mediumship. Something I forgot to mention is that the most compelling instance of prophecy in literature that meets all the criteria, so specific, proper names, time frame, that kind of thing, it's not actually in the introduction to the Book of the Law. It's in the Equinox was a periodical, and I can't remember which, if it's Equinox 10 or whatever. But the first time he published the Book of the Law, Crowley published it in this other thing, this periodical. And it's in there He says, before the new aeon can officially commence, the world must be soaked in blood by the Great War, and Great War is capitalized. This was 4 years before the start of World War I, who historians unanimously recognize as the beginning of the modern era. He also said that in 100 years' time, there would be an epidemic of bisexual and epicene, which is old school for non-binary people, gender fluid, right? A bunch of other stuff. And that book is a red book called Libreville Legis. At the same time, Jung, I believe it was the same time, published Liber Lovus, I think it's called. It looks just like the Book of the Law, little red book. And Jung had his prophetical vision of World War I at the same time that Crowley published this, like roughly the same time. That strikes me as interesting because when you have people that are at a similar level of coherence and also in the same archetypal resonant channel, they are going to be entrained to a degree that transcends dispositional similarities and personality isomorphism, and So he got into mediumship, and from 1899 to 1900, Jung participated in extended seances with his 15-year-old cousin, Helene Preiswerk, who went into trance states and channeled apparent personalities. His doctoral dissertation was based on these observations. He used it as a scientific frame while privately taking the content seriously. He observed apparent xenoglossy, speaking in languages not known to the subject, personality switching, and what he considered genuine dissociative states producing information the subject could not normally access. I should mention that I personally don't necessarily attribute this to actual communication with the dead, where it is actually their like subjective being that is being interacted with. For a long time, I felt that these kind of experiences are real in a way, but it's more like a 0-point field informational residue that you're interacting with. If it's true that time is not linear, then if information is retained at like a quantum level, or even in a field, then the entire life history and experience of every individual is recorded. And if you watch my Eliphas Levi, I read the entire Transcendental Magic and gave commentary. I encountered that idea in his like 1851 book, and it's remarkable also to note that there is scientific support for this kind of concept, and for this guy to be talking about it in the way that he is in that book, it's insane. It's like a digital recording. He's describing it almost in those words in like the mid 1800s. Also, he frames consciousness as an electromagnetic phenomena, but that's what he that's how he evaluated it. And I have tested this as well because with ayahuasca, you often encounter deceased relatives and all sorts of strange things. And if you push in certain directions, they start to seem like AI. And that is very consistent with this idea that what you're actually interacting with in these situations is just there's probably a better word than informational residue or a husk, like a clip out shell of the dead kind of scenario. But yeah, that's an interesting thing. I've had experiences also where I knew things that I couldn't possibly know without any guessing. I was counseling a friend whose brother was murdered, and he wanted to murder the guy that murdered his brother, but he couldn't because the guy had already been murdered. He was a cartel executioner at one point or something. And when I knew him, he was old and, harmless-ish. I guess he was thinking about shooting me after I did this because it made him really, he's Christian, and he's like, holy shit, this dude's possessed. How do you do that? But I knew the name of the girl that set him up. I knew the name of their dog. I knew all kinds of stuff. And I attributed that to the possibility of a feedback loop between the two of us. And all that information was in his head. So it doesn't necessarily mean I'm channeling it from anywhere. And then I did it with my mom a few weeks later, where this voice in my head told me, call your mother and ask her what really happened to John Michael, my middle name is Michael John, after this guy. That was my mom's best friend when she was around the time she got pregnant with me. And she lied to me about how he died because it was drugs and he did it on purpose. And so it told me, ask her about Steve Miller. So I called my mom and I was like, what really happened to John Michael? And she's just kind of weird, like, what, And I said, who is Steve Miller? And then there was just 30 seconds of silence. And she's like, that's the guy he caught with his girlfriend and that's the reason he unalived himself. So that's weird, but then I realized that when I think I hear a voice, I have an internal monologue, and I was in my mother's stomach on or about the time that she would have heard about this. If there is memory that can be inherited, which I strongly suspect is the case, especially with your, mother more so than the father. You know what I mean? It's still not certain that that voice was actually a spirit or that the information was channeled, because I was in my mom's womb when she had the information. So, yeah. That's what you have to do with this stuff too. And people don't want to do that because you want to believe things. We have these biases, and, we are hesitant to actually apply critical thinking to our sacred cows because you don't want to slit their throats. But that's what you got to do if they're not true. It doesn't matter how much you like the idea. If it's not true, you got to let go of it if you can prove to yourself that it's not. I get criticized sometimes because people see this as negative, like I'm trying to tear down everybody's belief system and stuff. But guess what? That's what intelligence does. That you don't try to find evidence in favor of things. You try to deconstruct them and see, that's just how you're supposed to do it. And it doesn't matter what the domain is, yeah. Really important to have that objectivity and the courage to have that objectivity. So in 1909, during a meeting with Freud in Vienna, Jung felt that what he described as a catalytic exteriorization phenomena building inside of him. A strange diaphragmatic pressure, a loud bang, then came from the bookcase. Jung told Freud it was a paranormal phenomena and predicted another would follow. It did immediately. Freud dismissed it entirely. Jung wrote later that this moment revealed a fundamental incompatibility in their worldview. Freud's epistemological rigidity was itself the thing Jung could no longer work within. And that's wild to think about. And I see that kind of thing all the time, where people can look at evidence directly in the face and then act like it's not there. People do this in the political arena constantly. It's insane, and this is another reason that understanding the nervous system and its neural gating and the default mode network and all, predictive processing and the power that it actually has to modulate your perceptions helps you to understand other people. They don't see what you see. It's not that they're actually lying necessarily. It's not that they're actually stupid necessarily. It's literally that their nervous system is editing their perceptions and mediating the meaning of signals that make it pass that don't fit with the generative model that the predictive processing system has generated. That's why you have to do this work at the level of the hardware, and there are ways to kind of bypass the confrontational barricade. One of the reasons that I think I've been more effective than some other approaches that the clients have described is that I am not restrained by the conventional dictates of politesse, right? I'm not really worried about offending you. If you get offended, you probably won't be here in the first place. And, you have to go after these political priors and religious priors fundamentally. And because the brain, all of these fundamental priors have ancillary correlates. So there's like a distributed network of symbolic interrelations. So in conventional therapeutic approaches, you are like trimming the hedges. Whereas if you go after these fundamental priors, then you are pulling them up by their roots, and you're also removing the things that they are symbolically interconnected with. So, the difficulty with or the inefficacy of conventional modalities is largely just the result of being polite and working within parameters that are kind of dictated by our sociological ethics or whatever. The road to hell is paved with good intentions. Enhanced intuition as conscious diagnostic tool. Beyond discrete psi events, Jung described his clinical intuition as qualitatively different from ordinary inference, and he theorized it rigorously. He placed intuition as one of the four primary psychological functions, alongside thinking, feeling, and sensation, and described it as perception via the unconscious. The ability to apprehend the totality of a situation, including its trajectory, without going through sequential analysis or stepwise thinking. He believed the periods of maximum unconscious activation heightened this function, specifically flooding him with information he couldn't account for rationally. I had never heard of Jung describing this, and you guys can go back through. I've been describing this forever. You can find it described by Timothy Leary. You can find it described by every magician and every shaman that is legit and has ever lived. This is not some fringy thing. This is a consistent experience reported across time and throughout the globe. So you have to think about our institutions and the fact that they are basically subject to the same psychological mechanisms and their comorbidities as individual humans. Selective perception, for example, bias, delusion, even collective pathology. There's a collective pathology that is actually, there's a term that describes exactly this thing that I can't recall it at the moment. But anyways, yeah, there's a term for this. And when they say that there's no evidence for X, Y, and Z, in many cases, it's completely untrue. There is a sort of epistemological barrier that empiricism sort of, it's baggage that comes with empiricism. You can disregard things, that you can refuse knowledge that does not pander to your prejudice. You can use empiricism to do that, to an inappropriate degree, which doesn't mean that empiricism's not important, but it's only one aspect of inquiry. Pattern recognition and transposition, compression, and synthesis can result in a knowledge that you can be to a fair degree of certainty that extends beyond the epistemological barriers of empiricism. And it's not invalid. At a certain point, an aggregate of circumstantial or anecdotal evidence becomes something other than circumstantial evidence. In the domain of common sense, And the thing is, if you take anything too far, it becomes its opposite. So empiricism is intelligent until you take it to the point where it is overriding common sense and inculcating bias in all of your institutions, and then it becomes fucking stupidity, And that's kind of where we're at now. We're overcoming it to a degree in recent years, thanks to people like Michael Levin and maybe Rupert Sheldrake, although I'm on the fence about him a little bit. You know what I mean, though? We are getting to a point where the aggregate of that type of evidence has overwhelmed the roadblocks of empiricism and institutional bias and information monopoly. It's eroding their fences, kids. So this information that he couldn't account for rationally, he explicitly distinguished this from guessing. In clinical settings, he reportedly knew things about patients he had no conventional means of knowing, which he attributed to the collective unconscious, creating resonant fields between psyches, which is exactly how I've always thought about it and how a lot of different people in different domains of science are starting to think about it. He developed the concept of synchronicity precisely to account for cases where his intuitive apprehensions were externally corroborated in ways that made chance implausible. And again, if you understand synchronicity as higher order symmetries, right? There are symmetries of form and function, for example, that are not just like architectural symmetries or or experiential symmetries. And if it is true that this is a holographic information system where meaning is architectural, then synchronicity as a communication from a distributed intelligence that is not agential suddenly works within a framework that does not violate any scientific theory, and it does another quite wonderful and miraculous thing. It simultaneously acknowledges the individual as in the sense that the architecture of the universe is tipping its hat to them, and it legitimately is. However, if you also understand that it's not necessarily... let me give some more context for this. There were 3 deaths that had a certain relationship to me. They were famous people, and there was a message that the death of the last one kind of drove home that was highly specific to what I was experiencing at the time, as well as, there was a lot of relational stuff going on. And I know that I am not so significant that the universe unalived these people in a specific order in order to send a message to me. It's not unrelated either, right? So in a holographic information system, there's no issue with that, with both things being true. And so it lifts the individual above the morass of existentialism while also negating the inclination for it to feed or the propensity for it to feed ego inflation. Because people, oftentimes make that mistake, like, oh, I must be the chosen one because this thing happened. People were unalive to send me a message. And you know what I mean? It can do that to you. And that's how you know it's truth, or at least it's a good indication that it's truth, because it has this balancing, positive, attenuating, coherence increasing effect rather than inflating the ego, or whereas a really committed materialist would dismiss it as just a really improbable coincidence. You know what I mean? Both of those things are wrong and they're not very helpful, right? So when you find an answer that actually has balance like that, truth is self-substantiating, and so there's an indication that possibly we're on the right track here. So Jung's response to these experiences was neither to suppress them nor to naively accept them, but to build a theoretical container rigorous enough to hold them without either pathologizing or mystifying them. Synchronicity, the principle of acausal meaningful connection, was his attempt to give these phenomena a non-supernatural but also non-reductive framework. He collaborated with physicist Wolfgang Paul, a Nobel laureate, on a joint publication specifically to anchor synchronicity in quantum physics' own non-local anomalies. He also engaged seriously with J.B. Rhine's parapsychology laboratory at Duke, studying the ESP card test data, and wrote that Rhine's statistical results were difficult to explain away, while remaining publicly cautious about endorsing it, psi, as a mechanism. See, and that's why I like Jung and Dr. Stanley Krippner and Aleister Crowley and Eliphas Levi, Robert Anton Wilson, all of the people that are willing to do that, to walk that line where it's like, okay, there's more to the universe than our mainstream conventional model will tolerate, but also it is a mechanistic universe, and these things have to have mechanisms that facilitate them. There has to be some operating system for them to work on, or else that's, if not, then it's impossible, And I have never understood why this is so difficult for the mainstream of humanity until I came to understand how our predictive processing system works, and also the incentive that the management team of Slavery Inc. Has to create these interference patterns so that people don't fall into entrainment and start to have a more holistic experience of the universe. I mean, if you think about what these fucking people are doing, it is really diabolically mean, because so much wasted potential, so much, like when you have this dialogue with the living universe, life is so much more rewarding and interesting and purposeful. Existential crisis is like the worst thing that humanity, it's the collective pathology that is basically facilitating all the exploitation and a lot of the worst atrocities, well, all of them really, on the global scale, on like the scale of like a municipality, a community, and it's an engineered circumstance, right? And it actually, everything in the universe, I think, makes sense. It's all happening for a reason. I can see where all of these things sit in the developmental trajectory of the human race. But I also feel like we're at the point where, whether it was part of the process and therefore essential or not, it is time for it to end. Or to change, and it must do so very rapidly. So either way, we should be excited about this shit. The pattern across all of it is consistent. The periods of maximum psychic opening, the breakdown years, the active imagination sessions, which is happening in the global human race right now, spiritual awakening, increased intuition, pattern recognition exploding in people, right? Does this all sound familiar? Like me or Carl Jung or the shaman, the magician crossing the whatever. It's happening on the macro scale, which is indicative of one of these symmetry, threshold, bifurcation, manifold moments in an information system, which is what humanity is, right? So what's going to happen now is the system is either going to completely decohere and destabilize, or it's going to partially do that in order to give itself the space to reconfigure so it can solvate, coagulate at a higher recursive layer. That's what's happening. It's the global shamanic crisis, the global chapel perilous. Produced the most intense anomalous experiences, which he then used as source data rather than symptoms to be eliminated. That recursive move, treating the anomalous as information rather than noise, is probably the most useful thing in his entire legacy for someone doing this kind of work. Yeah. Um, so yeah, we'll continue on with this stream. It is 1:13 in the morning, and like I said, I didn't get a ton of sleep last night. So I'll check in with the chat. Let's see what's good in the hood. I don't see any questions to answer. All right, y'all. I guess, please consider sharing these streams. I feel like this one kind of picked up later on into the stream, which always bums me out because that's just how my mind works. This is all stream of consciousness, and the first few minutes I'm always kind of groping around, and then I know that when this is reposted, I'll lose a lot of people while I'm getting my shit together. But that's the way that you have to do this stuff if you really want those emergent lightning strike moments. That's why the Grateful Dead would improvise for 10 or 15 minutes, and then these things would emerge, and sometimes they wouldn't, and they would just musically ramble and nothing would happen for half an hour. But you just have to take those chances, and see if the organizing principle decides to emerge and make something out of things. And it's more reliable than you would think, but magic doesn't always work either. So thank you guys so much for spending this time with me, and I'll see you sooner than later. Cheers.